This room, this room, according to a story by Ron Haskins, was filled with Republicans post Gingrich, and they were about to vote on the Ways and Means, Talent, merged welfare reform bill. But Representative Mike Castle had come in with a centrist bill, which at the last minute, which was actually quite upsetting. So the Rules Committee decided that Castle could present his version. First, it would be voted on, and then if it lost, he would support the Ways and Means bill. So Representative Talent is very, very agitated over this. He's in the back corner over there, at that time in the closet, pacing back and forth with the door open, and he sees Castle conferring with 2 or 3 other people, and he says, "That's out of protocol. You can't be dealing like that. You got to be on the up and up and make your presentation." So Ron Haskins goes over there to check it out. He comes back to Representative Talent in the closet, and he says, "Don't worry about it. They're talking about something else." Representative Talent then says, "I'm such a suspicious person. I'm a flawed individual." And then he says, he concludes by saying, "God is not finished with me yet." So I'd love to work with a guy who's got that kind of humility, and it doesn't happen often. Okay, we are co-sponsored by the Secretary's Innovation Group, which is a organization about which I'm the executive director that has members that are human services secretaries from 19 states, making up 46% of the country, and we deal with policy issues, but also programmatic issues and management issues. I have 3 colleagues here that I'd like to have come up. The first is Doug Besheroff from the University of Maryland, who's going to welcome you here as well. That was what we had decided, but we don't need to do it, Doug. All right. Governor Thompson, great. Glad you're here. Cheers. Come on up.
Thank you, Jason. You were a lot nicer when you used to work for me.
Okay. Now, okay. I'm going to go through in 3 minutes what happened between 1984 and 2001. In 1981, President Reagan made modest changes to AFTC eligibility in his first budget bill. And 3 years later, in 1984, Charles Murray published Losing Ground, which created a lively debate, and no introduction to this group is necessary. Professor Larry Mead, who's with us today, of New York University, in 1986, just 2 years later, wrote Beyond Entitlement, the first book to argue for work obligation as a basis for welfare reform. Then a diverse group of important thinkers convened by AEI, one of our organization co-sponsors, published the New Consensus on Family in Welfare, in which a bipartisan group, of which Doug Besheroff, one of our co-sponsors, was a primary author, and suggested that both sides of the left and right could coalesce around the idea of mutual obligation. Again, in 1986, still again, Governor Mario Cuomo of New York brought together 5 future members of the Clinton administration: Mary Jo Bain, Peter Edelman, David Ellwood, Robert Reich, Donna Shalala, and concluded that society should require work in exchange for public support. And then finally, in 1986, Mickey Kaus, one of our panelists here today, wrote a long and influential article in the New Republic that became a book, in which he said a public job at a wage slightly below minimum is the only way to promote work as a condition. In 1988, Harvard professor and future Clinton HHS official David Ellwood published Poor Support, in which he proposed a 2-year AFTC time limit after which work is required with some sort of job guarantee. Then, in 1987, President Reagan created the Interagency Low Income Advisory Board, which was intended to be a one-stop shop for those states that wanted to pursue welfare reform waivers. In 1988, led by Senate Finance member Patrick Moynihan, the Family Support Act was passed based on an education and training model, but unfortunately, the AFDC caseloads went up by about a third in the 4 years after it was implemented. Then in 1981, the results came in that seemed to confirm from California that a workforce, employment-first approach yields better results than education and training. In 1992, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton ran on the promise to end welfare as we know it. The phrase, the invention of Bruce Reed, one of our panelists here today, with thought leadership emanating from the Progressive Policy Institute and its executive director, Will Marshall, who's also here today. 2 years later, the task force on welfare had 3 co-chairs and published Work and Responsibility Act in the month of June 1994. After the first 2 Clinton years in 94, Newt Gingrich decided to nationalize the election with 10 promises made in the contract with America, one of which featured welfare reform. And in the 1994 election, Republicans took the House, the Senate, and increased their state houses from 19 to 30, and the contract bill, H.R. 4, was introduced in January 1995. After that, there were several Republican iterations of the bill, and after having vetoed 2 bills, advanced to his desk on the third try, President Clinton signed a modified bill. This is followed by the resignation of 3 high-level HHS officials, including former Deputy Assistant Secretary Wendell Primus, who's with us today. In the immediate period after the implementation of the bill, of the legislation, the big 3 indicators, which are employment, dependency, and poverty, all simultaneously moved strongly in the right direction, and a 4th, out-of-wedlock births, paused its previous rise. Well, no social legislation has been as studied and as debated as the welfare reform legislation that led to TANF, which is one reason why 20 years later we're still debating it. When in this room we have the people who were helped design and implement it, and the original coalition, which is PPI. AEI is represented by Larry Mead and Doug Besheroff, and also the Maryland School of Public Policy. We have the 2 foremost governors who were at the forefront of that push, and we have the secretaries who are represented here through the Secretaries Innovation Group. And with that, I'm going to jump right in. Governor Thompson, I have a question for you. You were elected to start serving in January of 1987. You were long-serving governor through 2001. But in your election, your first election, you featured welfare reform as a major policy platform that may have played a large role in defeating an incumbent. So my question for you is, where did you get the idea that welfare reform is a major issue that would be worthy of featuring in your campaign?
Well, first off, thank you, Jason, for inviting Governor Engler and myself. It's good to see my good friend John, who he and I competed against each other in Michigan, Wisconsin. I'd come up with an idea, he'd steal it, and then he'd refine it, make it better, then I'd steal it back, and we had a tremendous contest going on who could do the best job possible in welfare reform. Pretty much like Michigan State versus Wisconsin football season. It was a labor of love between both of us. You have to understand the situation that I inherited. I'm in a Democratic state, a conservative Republican that nobody thought had a chance to win whatsoever. A popular Democrat governor by the name of Tony Earl was the governor and went running for re-election. And I was the only governor that year to defeat an incumbent governor in the United States. And one of the big reasons is that we had a terrible problem in Wisconsin. Tony Earl raised more money to increase welfare payments without requiring any kind of causal relation, any kind of response whatsoever. And so people from all over the Midwest, all the way down to Mississippi, were coming to Wisconsin to get on welfare reform. In fact, the New York Times was following several of those individuals and wrote stories about them. And it even got so bad that in the Greyhound bus depot in Chicago, there was a sign put up before I got elected that says, if you want more money, all you have to do is pay $25, get a round-trip bus trip to Madison or Milwaukee or Kenosha, and get on welfare, cash your check, and come back and live in Chicago. And it was a huge story, and everybody in Wisconsin was pretty upset about it. And so I had a debate with Tony Earl, and he kept saying, if Tommy Thompson gets elected governor, everybody from Mississippi, everybody's going to leave Wisconsin and go to Mississippi. And I said, well, Governor Earl, the truth of the matter is everybody from Mississippi is already here in Wisconsin because of your welfare payments. And he thought he was going to put me down. It was a line that got me a great deal of publicity throughout the state of Wisconsin, and we started welfare reform after I got elected. But it was the fact that people were misusing and taking advantage of the system that became a huge issue in Wisconsin. It was one of the reasons, not the only reason, there's several reasons that I won that year, mostly economic, but the welfare reform ideas were starting to take hold in Wisconsin before any place else, just because other people were abusing the system, and the people in Wisconsin were fed up of paying higher taxes in order to attract more people from other states to come and get on the welfare rolls. So
well, Governor, you also jumped in once you got elected with 5 demonstrations.
Yes.
And one of them was Learnfare that became well known throughout the country. Where did Learnfare come from? Most of the audience knows that unless specifically exempted, teenagers in AFDC families, including teen parents, must attend school regularly in order to receive their full AFDC check. Where did that come from?
Well, the truth of the matter is that I was sick and tired of building prisons in Milwaukee, and I wanted young individuals to go to school and get an education. So what I did is I invited welfare mothers to come to the executive residence and have lunch with me, just welfare mothers. And I got all my ideas, my best ideas for welfare reform from welfare mothers. And welfare mothers actually came to Madison, had lunch with me, very surprised that a Republican governor would invite them to the executive residence, which is a very nice place, and have lunch and talk about welfare reform. They're very skeptical, but a lot of them said, we got to do something about keeping our children in school. And that developed Learnfare, and that was one of many ideas that came out of my luncheons with welfare mothers that really gave me my best ideas for welfare reform.
Well, Governor Engler, I have a question for you, which is the following. You were the governor of Michigan from 1991 to 2003. When you took office, you inherited a budget deficit, and early on in your administration, you decided to end general assistance, which was highly controversial at the time. What was your thinking?
Well, thank you, first of all, Jason, for you and the... Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. Thank you to you and the Innovation Chiefs for having us all here today, and happy anniversary, everyone. 20 years ago today, it was signed by President Clinton, so quite a historic day. Going back, like Tommy, when I took office in 1990, he was the only one in 86 to be an incumbent. I was the only one to be an incumbent in 90. So I was copying Tommy every step of the way. He was from a larger town than me. He was from Elroy, Wisconsin, a lot bigger than Beale City, Michigan, but...
Neither one of us had any stop-and-go lights.
No, there were no traffic lights in either of our towns. But when I came into office, there was $2 billion in the hole, and we were worried that one of the problems that Michigan had been losing a lot of jobs. People have been moving out. We didn't have much capacity to be raising revenue. We said, look, our problem isn't we're spending too little, we're not spending it very well. And so in looking at all of the programs, and
the Department of Human Services, as it was named in those days, was not the only one that we looked at, but here was a program for single childless adults who were getting cash assistance from the state. We looked around the country, 35 other states didn't even have the program. This was not, would not have been in most of the country controversial. It was sort of embedded in the Michigan program for some time, and when we eliminated it, it was controversial, but we kept pointing out that we did maintain safety nets there in terms of there were food stamps and health benefits, but there was also the safety net called work, and about it was about 20 hours a week at minimum wage would more than replace the general assistance, and it was the philosophy that we started with that aid and support should be temporary as we move people from needing assistance to more independence, and you started that by going to work. First day you work and the first money you earn gets you that much closer to the day when you do become independent. And that was the decision. That was just the beginning. One of the interesting things, and this also became something I know Jim Talent and members of the majority when the House switched in '94 were focused on the ability to create some different kinds of partnerships. We were being criticized that the elimination of general assistance would lead to this dramatic rise in homelessness, and what would the state do about that? And was that clearly an unacceptable risk? That led to a very unique partnership, and the one fellow who couldn't be here today, but we miss very much, is Dr. Jerry Miller. Jerry's in Florida, but he had some family matters to take care of today, so he couldn't get up here. But Jerry was very much involved. Jerry was the director of the department. He was a counterpart to Jason and others. But Jerry had been the budget director for Michigan in the 1970s, and he'd been down here in Washington running NASBO, the National Association of State Budget Officers. When Jerry came back, the Department of Human Services was bigger in budget-wise than the entire state government was when he left. So there had been a little bit of a dramatic increase. So I said, I'm not asking you to come back and do something smaller. This is actually a bigger department. But Jerry figured out with the leadership of the Salvation Army in Michigan that we could enter into a contract with the Salvation Army to work with us on homelessness. They only had 100+ years of experience there. And that contract was stunningly successful because then what we would do is, and we had these toll-free numbers, if anybody saw anybody who was homeless anywhere, call the Army. And so instead of the TV camera going out and, taking a shot of somebody in the street and saying, what's going to happen to this person? And then they would ask the press secretary, the governor, what are you going to do about this? Look, you saw this person. Did you call the Salvation Army? Did you lend a hand? You came across this person. And it really, Michigan has pretty tough winters like Wisconsin. We did not have an issue because of the very fine work the Salvation Army did, and it was a massive public-private partnership. And the Army itself actually had to deal with that a little bit internally because they hadn't been in quite that level of interconnectedness with the government. But we said, you know how to do this. Rather than the state trying to build shelters and try to operate them, why not go to the people who have been doing this? And it was interesting. The biggest pushback we got actually were some of the people who needed help who said, but I don't want to go to the Salvation Army because you have to get up in the morning and they've got chores to do. There's no alcohol and drugs. There's some restrictions on my freedom here. And at that point, the public support pretty quickly evaporated. So wait a minute. And so anyway, that got us started, Jason. And then, like Tommy said, there was a tremendous competition in the early '90s, back and forth.
Let me ask Governor Thompson about something that led to that competition, if I might. Governor Thompson, the Reagan White House had an official, Chuck Hobbs, whose job it was to help states think of and submit waivers to the federal government for welfare. And he told me that when he started in this job, he didn't know if any governors were actually going to meet with him or pay attention to him. He said, I got off the prop plane in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and the governor met with me. But nobody had a better relationship with the two symbiotic than the White House and you, beginning in the late '80s. And can you tell us what your thinking was at the time. Now, at the end, there's 45 states and 80 waivers, but you started in the late 1980s. Did you know at that time it was going to be a tsunami, or were you just doing one thing at a time and finding out what happened next?
I was doing one thing at a time, but I was hoping for a tsunami. And Chuck Hobbs was a great American, and he came and he talked to me, and also President Reagan came and campaigned for me, and when I first ran for governor, and was in Waukesha County, and I had a chance to talk to President Reagan, and he said, you know, I tried welfare reform when I was governor of California, and he said, I was unsuccessful. I'm counting on you, Tommy, and other governors to come forward with good ideas. He said, I'm going to set it up and make it easy for you. And that's when he appointed Chuck Hobbs. And I remember that conversation. It was on a Thursday afternoon in Waukesha, and it stayed with me. He said, I'm counting on you to come up with new, innovative ideas, and I will help you. And Chuck Hobbs was, every time I called him, he was there. And I was very successful in getting waivers. I got waivers from President Reagan, George H. Bush, and Bill Clinton. I think I'm the only governor that's ever got waivers from three setting precedents on welfare reform. But everybody really wanted to help and do something because they saw the problem. Like John and like me and other governors, we wanted to do something and change it.
Well,
so what started out as an idea became a tsunami.
You set the dynamic because you would propose one or two every year. So if you were opposed to welfare reform, you didn't get any rest in the state legislature. And I think that was another factor, wasn't it? And what do you think about that, Governor Engler?
Well, there's no question. I mean, Tommy's right. And when I walked in, I bumped into Susan Carlson. She gave me memoirs from her husband, Bob, who was part of that Reagan Revolution and very much a part of this. And it is interesting because we got started, President Bush 41 was in office. But and Bruce will get into this, I'm sure, but it was pretty stunning in 1992 to have a Democratic candidate for president, albeit a 12-year veteran in the governor's office, talking about ending welfare as we know it. Wait a minute, what's that doing coming from the Democratic candidate for president? But that was a pretty decisive moment, and so, but because of that, there was no real slacking off on waivers once President Clinton took office. So it just continued on. In fact, in one sense, it validated, I think, a lot of what Tommy had been doing, what we'd been doing, because here's President Clinton talking about it, and so, but I think if you look at from certainly I'll say from Michigan's standpoint, but I suspect Wisconsin and the northern industrial states, let's just say the generosity of the welfare programs in Arkansas perhaps were somewhat less than what we were dealing with in the northern states. And if you got
Is
the
that why
president,
they kept coming north?
I think it could be. I think it could be. But if they're talking about welfare reform, then we sure as heck ought to be talking about welfare reform because the disparity pretty significant.
Well, Governor, Governor Engler, you were in 1995 and 96, the critical year before the passage. You were chair of the Republican Governors Association, and you, Governor Thompson, the same period were chair of the NGA. What a team that was. That was one heck of a powerhouse.
Now, we call those the glory years, actually, but,
It really was. I mean, we accomplished a great deal.
There was a Governor Engler, you in particular were looking for the maximum amount of flexibility. In fact, you said conservative micromanagement is no better than liberal micromanagement, and yet that's not exactly what happened in the end. What's your current thinking about the relative balance between having strong work requirements while you also have a block grant, as opposed to having unfettered block grant entirely? What's your thinking?
Well, I believe that the nation's governors were in no way interested in some race to the bottom. I don't think that was ever a fair criticism. We heard that, certainly from one part of the debate. On the other hand, we had a lot of people who were supposed to be allies who wanted to give us a lot more help and direction. They had sort of forgotten this concept that we were pretty keen on, and that's the idea of federalism. Let the states work on this. Let us try to solve some of these problems. And that competition among the states is going to get you some pretty good results, we thought, and we didn't need, as I said, conservative micromanagement as a replacement for liberal micromanagement. Micromanagement was the problem. Give us the flexibility and let us try to solve the problems, and that's what you saw. And I think even what emerged, the fight, obviously, in '95, you've got now a Republican House for the first time in 40 years. Speaker Gingrich, who had incorporated welfare reform into the Contract with America, that was part of that document, was committed, and to his great credit, and he probably is, if you said single most unsung hero, it probably has to be the Speaker, because he's navigating between the president who's going to be running for re-election in '96, the leader of the Senate who wants to be the candidate for president in '96 would like to be elected, and so you got different agendas at play here, but you did have the leadership of the House passionately committed to doing welfare reform, to doing policy, trying to do bodacious big things, as they would talk about, and probably the most bodacious thing he did in the beginning was he invited the governors to come sit at the table and say, what do we need? And so as a result, as you know, from Wisconsin, Jason, but and Jerry Miller, who I mentioned earlier, and a few other states, because you had Bill Weld was very much in a reform mode in those days, and there were others out there. But we were able to bring some of the top staff people in from the states, and they literally sat around and worked with guys like Ron Haskins and Howard Cohen, because Medicaid was in the first iterations. It was in really the reason that the first two bills got vetoed was the inclusion of Medicaid as a block grant. And finally, in August, 20 years ago now, the Medicaid came out. We didn't get all we wanted, but we got, the old AFTC program was gone. TANF replaced it. We kind of got taken to the cleaners on maintenance of effort. That was one of those fights we just couldn't quite win. That was that insurance against the race to the bottom was I thought, an overly restricted maintenance of effort clause, because what that did is deprive us of flexibility to put monies where we needed it, whether it was a Learnfare approach or,
one of the things you did, Governor Engler and Thompson, with the flexibility that you had, which I think was quite extraordinary, is you created a welfare program in which everybody participated in work activity. Right. Wisconsin Works had no exemptions. You were in one of 4 work tiers, including people who had health problems. Governor Engler, you put out Project Zero, in which the goal was to make certain that there were 0 people at the end of the period who were doing nothing. Right. So in both of those cases, it's a form of universal engagement. What was your thinking at the time as to, it was unusual because at that time you put people in categories of can work or can't work. That was the thinking. And you guys both overrode that thinking with this universal engagement.
Yeah, I would say people who actually put themselves in the category of never work. I mean, that they didn't think that was something we did. You were getting, it was in '95 that we actually changed the name of the Human Services Agency to the Family Independence Agency, with the rationale we want to communicate to everyone that the support is expected to be transitional, that we want to be able to move you back. But one of the changes, and we actually got some waivers on this, as did Tommy. I'm not sure who got the first one on this, but the making work pay, where it used to be the federal rules were ridiculous. The first dollar you earn, you immediately started getting a cut in benefits. Right. People didn't take long to figure out, well, why am I going to work if I'm no more money ahead? I can, So we ended up in a situation where the first, I know in Michigan the rule was $200. The first $200 you earned, you had $200 more dollars. And maybe the people in the room, well, that's not very much. It was a big deal.
But there was tension because President Clinton said, if I don't get the bill I want to reform welfare, I'm going to reform welfare one waiver at a time. And Governor Thompson, you took him up on that. You actually presented and handed a personal copy of your waiver request, which he then referenced on the subsequent Saturday talk and said, we're going to do this. Yeah. And then, of course,
if my memory serves me correctly, Jason Turner had something to do with that.
I'm in the index, but it was actually quite unusual.
Yeah, it was. But there was one point, Jason. I really want. I talked to you about having welfare mothers come in and building upon what John Engler just said. I brought these welfare mothers in, and it was basically, and I gave this story, the speech on the floor of the House, in one of the committees with, who was it?
Charlie, probably. Charlie.
No, the
Oh.
congressman from Florida, Shaw.
Oh, Clay Shaw, yeah.
Clay Shaw. And I said, welfare mothers really want to work. The vast majority really want to work. You got to give them the tools to do it. So I would call them in and I said, why don't you go to work? And they said, well, Governor, if we go to work, we lose our health care for our children. And I said, well, that's sort of stupid. And they said, yeah. And I said, well, if we got health care for your children, would you go to work? Yes, but who's going to take care of the kids if I go to work? And I said, okay. What if we provide you with daycare? So health care and daycare. And then they said, yes, but I got pregnant when I was 14 or 15. I got a kid, and I dropped out of school, and I don't have any skills. What if I provide vocational education for you to have the opportunity to get a job? They said, that'd be great. Then I said, well, would you go to work then? They said, yes, but most of the jobs are not in the neighborhoods that I live. So I said, what if we provide transportation? They said, we'll go to work. And that story, the fact that welfare mothers actually wanted to go to work if they had the tools, and as John said, don't take the money away from them, put it back in. And you remember, Jason, we asked the federal government to give us a waiver for the money we would save to plow it back in to daycare, health care, and transportation and education. And that's really the keys to making it. And you have to realize that if you give women the opportunity with tools off of welfare to get off, they will do it. And that's exactly what we did and exactly what a lot of governors did throughout America.
The other group that gets engaged here, interesting enough, are the caseworkers themselves, because finally, I mean, a lot of people go into this work really are going in sincerely wanting to help people. What they were doing in the past was, they were keeping track of statistics. They were sitting in front of a computer screen maybe, or they were just doing data. Suddenly, when we were doing Project Zero, like Tommy said, it was interesting. Different families had different needs. Yeah. Somebody might have had grandma to do the child care, but they didn't have the transportation. Somebody had the transportation and the child care, but they didn't have the right clothes. I mean, you literally had all kinds of things going on, but the caseworkers had to get to know the case and the family and the situation. And so you literally, in Project Zero, Ottawa County was the first county in Michigan where everybody who was on public assistance, and they were still getting public assistance, but now everybody either had outside income or were in a position where they were training to work or in a voluntary situation, but they were all out of the home. And we knew exactly what it was going to take to help move that family to the next step.
Well, then let me ask you this question, which relates to both of that, and then I'm going to call for questions. The biggest consistent criticism of TANF today is that it's, quote, a funding stream. It's not a, quote, program. Funds are going to other things than cash services to the poor or child care and work programs, and a lot of it's being used for child welfare, for example. Can each of you comment on that criticism?
Well, let me start maybe by picking on one of my good friends, Sean Kasich, who's in the New York Times, saying welfare reform in 1996 didn't work. Well, it absolutely worked. The numbers are very clear. I was looking at something, and since Ron Haskins is coming up a little bit later on, this is what he wrote. He said that by 2000, the poverty rate of black children was the lowest it had ever been. The percentage of families in deep poverty defined as half the poverty level also declined until 2000, falling about 35% during the period. Now, that's Ron's writing. But there's all kinds of other statistical evidence that it worked. But is there more to be done? Sure. But I would argue, let the governors maintain the flexibility, and I would also make, in the rearview mirror, had we been able to block grant Medicaid, I don't know what the American healthcare system would look like, but and Tommy and I, along with Mike Levitt, were the three Republicans who sat endless hours with Roy Romer, Lawton Childs, and Bob Miller. The six of us, and unfortunately, Bruce kept changing Roy's mind every time he'd leave the room. They'd send him back, and he'd have.
If you remember, they came back. Bruce and his gang of thieves came back and said, we can buy it without Medicaid.
Yeah, well, that's what they did.
And then Bob Miller, and he.
Well, we had Romer a couple of times on Medicaid.
Romer was up to
Yeah,
the
but
altar
White House
several
and-
times, but he wouldn't get pregnant. He kept backing off.
But had we done that, I think we'd have had a lot. But I would say that where we are today is that, yes, there's continued work to be done. You've had a hostile administration. I mean, this is not a priority of the current group. This is not somebody who thinks like the president did who came from Arkansas. I don't know what it'll be in the future, but if you get the kind of environment we had back then, which was, as Tommy indicated, largely bipartisan. I mean, we had people on both ends, sort of like Washington today, on the right and on the left, who they were very troubled by different things that they were troubled about. But those of us who actually, and what Tommy and I made the case, and our colleagues, other governors in both parties, said, look, there's one difference between us and the people in the think tanks and the think tanks on right and left. We actually are running programs. We're out in the states where the cases are, where the families are, and like Tommy said, we're talking to people. Give the men and women who are the governors of America and their legislatures a chance. Let's bring federalism back. Let's try it, because the other alternative isn't very good.
Let's open it up to a couple of questions. Who's got a, yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
It did work. And as John says, it did work. Poverty went down and more people were working. In Wisconsin, Jason, we had a caseload of over 100,000. We went down below 10,000 of people on AFDC when we were really on top of it, manage it. You got to manage it, you got to change it, but you got to also, and as John said, if we could have block granted Medicaid, we could have changed the health care and made the system even better. And the problem is, if you're going to make any program work, you've got to have people like the John Englers and the Jason Turners that are going to be involved and make the changes necessary to keep it going. And what has happened, nobody has really picked up the cudgel like us governors back in the 90s really did. We wanted it to work. We made sure it was going to work because we were very skeptical, and we were very upset with people saying, all John Engler and Tommy Thompson would do is want to race to the bottom and get the money and spend it on something else. It was the farthest thing from our mind. We wanted the best program possible, and that's the attitude and the ideas you got to have in order to make it work.
Absolutely. Management's the key as well as policy. Okay, yes, go ahead right here. Identify yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Buford, and I
Yes, do we, oh, there's.
Mike coming down the aisle.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Buford, and I have my own consulting group. Governor Engler, I appreciated your comment about the Salvation Army. I'm wondering what the impact of charitable choice as an amendment to the 96 welfare reform, what you saw as the impact of that.
Well, I'm not sure I'm able to give you a good analysis. I put it under the category of whatever flexibility can be created, and it can be done constitutionally, legally. I'm all for it. And I believe that some of the faith-based organizations, I mean, all charity, well, I won't say all, much of charity only was faith-based in the beginning. So I certainly have no problem going back to some of the people who are the most experienced to call upon their help.
Question? Yes, Tamara.
Hi, Tamar Jacoby. So in recent years, when there was some discussion of TANF reauthorization, there was a discussion draft that was going to create more flexibility for education and training. Mm-hmm. And there were sort of disputes over that, and it didn't happen. You've both talked about education and training. Obviously, we had the Moynihan example of just education and training doesn't work. But is there some kind of balance? Is there some way to think about how to combine work requirements and education and training?
I think it's absolutely vital. I mean, if you're going to really help people get out of poverty, you got to be able to put the resources into education and train them for jobs that are available and jobs that are going to be out there. Don't train them for jobs that aren't, because that's just a waste of money and a waste of their time. And people are too smart. So absolutely, it's got to be a very key part of any kind of TANF changes, and I'm fully in favor of it. especially vocational training, because there's so many jobs out there that go wanting. And with a little vocational training, you could get them in, especially in the healthcare fields, just absolutely crying for people to get into it. And that could really help a lot of welfare mothers get out of welfare and out of assistance into the workforce.
One of the stunning things to me, and I've always talked about, gee, if you could only do things over again, but it is a mystery to me why people who care about poverty don't care about public education in urban areas. I mean, how in the world can you sit that debate out? In Detroit, the National Report Card, the NAEP, the reading scores is 5% of Detroit children can read proficiently at the end of the 3rd grade. But everybody who lives in a suburb, don't be comforted by this. It's 36% for the nation's population. I believe America can teach all of its children to read by the time they're done with the 3rd grade, read proficiently. We're teaching 1 in 3 today. How in the world can any of us accept that? In a digital society, everybody's got to be literate. I mean, you're all carrying around these. How in the world, if you can't read, are you going to be able to succeed? And we spend $650 billion a year on that K through 12 establishment, and I think it's everybody's interest to get that starting to pay some dividends for us. And Tommy's right. The vocational training is very important. One of the big myths that's been talked about in this country is everybody needs to go to college. Everybody does not need to go to college. Everybody needs to have a skill, though. They need to be able to do something. And it's America. Anybody can go to college. But as we've raised graduation rates, if you look at remediation rates in colleges, they've gone along in tandem. And today, half the people who go to college don't graduate. So if you want to increase college graduates in America, it's not about who didn't get admitted to college. It's the fact that we don't graduate half who we do enroll.
Yes, right here.
Another thing I'd like to add. John and I were leading the efforts on welfare reform, but we're also leading the same efforts on education. And we had several retreats up in New York and so on and so forth that we invited all the governors. And John and I were the co-conveners of that, along with Roy Romer again, and Lawton Childs and Tom Carper and
Carper was very involved in it.
yeah. And so the governors back then realized education, and you just cannot do welfare reform on the cheap. We pull out the money back in, and we wanted to do a complete job, and that's why education is so important. Thank you for the question.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Randy Schmidt. I, in interest of full disclosure, was in Wisconsin during W2, late 1990s. I saw it more than probably I wanted to. But I'm really interested in the fact that Wisconsin has done so much welfare reform, and now Speaker Ryan is very interested in poverty as well. How do you think that the experiences in Wisconsin translate to his interest and maybe policy he might look at?
Oh, I think they all causal related. I mean, Paul was very much involved in with Jack Kemp, and he really is passionate about it, just like I was, on trying to change welfare for the better. Not to save money, but to actually give poor people an opportunity to get out of poverty and get into a meaningful job. And Paul is passionate about it. I'm absolutely certain, because Wisconsin was leading the effort back then when he was starting to run for Congress, that he definitely carried that to Washington and will continue to carry it to Washington. It's one of his driving forces right now.
And one of the important things, of course, is that you have a lot of governors like the two of you who bring things to the Congress and say, I want to do that. That's one of the things you hear from Congress. If we don't have demand from the bottom, then we don't have dough to work with in the Congress.
Tommy and I are also strong arguments against term limits, because both of us labored in the minority in the legislature, and we had to stomach for too many years a lot of things we didn't like. So by the time we finally got to the governor's office,
we had all these ideas.
We had a few ideas.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, stand up and announce, and then she'll bring it to you.
Bill Powers from the University of Maryland. States led by John Engler and Tommy Thompson are going to outpunch the federal government every time. But many of these initiatives got started, federal initiatives got started because the states weren't able to deliver. Do you have enough faith that most states are led by Tommy Thompsons and John Englers to deliver?
Hell no. That's why we're coming back.
we're as good once as we ever were, right? Is that the song, I think?
No, but I think, let me be very honest. I think most governors and most congressmen and women and senators run for the right reasons. I don't think, you're going to find exceptions, but I think most governors, Republicans and Democrat, are dedicated to do what is right and what is best for their state and their people.
We have room for one, at most two. The governors have a hard stop at 3:45. Yes, in the back. Just start talking and we'll get it to you.
My name is Cammy Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is in the context of third world economy, where governments usually are unable to support very poor people. And according to this curve, most people who have computers and digital videos, but then they get their electric supply cut off. Isn't that problem of mindset that somehow it's more important for me to have luxury items, but I shouldn't be very responsible about paying my bills than anything else? Thanks.
Well, yes, people should pay their bills. I mean, it's fascinating to me that people will pay a phone bill, but in Detroit they weren't paying the water bill because the state didn't collect the water bill. I mean, again, people are smart. People will make rational economic decisions. That's part of what we try to do, I think, is you're helping people, try to move from poverty to independence. Is in any case, you spend a lot of time, and I was on that board for a number of years. Gary McDougall's here, a great leader, kind of working with families. How do you manage money? How do you do these kinds of things? I mean, I think we realize you got to pay electric bills. And today, because the cable runs off the electricity, Detroit, they were paying electric bills. They just weren't paying water bills.
Last question. Right there.
The microphone. I'm Kathleen Kelly Frank. Just for context for my question, I worked in policy around welfare reform from 1985 to 1995. Governor Thompson, when you talk about you reduced the welfare rolls from 100,000 to 10,000.
Less than 10,000.
Less than 10,000. Are there any longitudinal studies documenting what happened to the 90,000? For example, did family stability increase? Were the children better taken? Did the children have better outcomes? Did the parents indeed get employment to earn a living wage, et cetera? Or did some, most, or all of them simply drop out of the system? Are there such studies?
Yeah, there's all kinds of studies. There's been study after study after study what took place during that period of time.
Including, Governor, if I might refresh your memory.
Because you were part of that.
Well,
That young lady over here was also part of it.
The state 2 years or 3 years or 4 years after the implementation of Wisconsin Works, the state actually went on to its computer system and tracked down everybody to find out what happened, how many got employed, and how many were still employed after 2 years. It was an extraordinarily high number who found employment in the 60s or 70s, and we'll get you that when you see me afterwards. We'll get you that study. And with that, the team is here, but the team. Go ahead.
Let me just say one thing about we had a stronger economy. Right now, we've got the slow. I'm at the Business Roundtable, so. We exist.
No, come on now, John. No commercials for God.
No, not a commercial. I'm just telling you, we measure these things, and this is a very poor economic, and so you don't separate. Again, this is something a lot of people say, well, what difference does the economy make? It makes all the difference. If we had 3.5% GDP growth, not 1.5%, there'd be a lot of opportunities. There's 5-6 million unfilled jobs in this country, 5 to 6 million unfilled. There'd be a lot more jobs, period, if you had a more robust economy. So those of you who are single issue voters on different things, I would just say don't forget the overall economy, because that's what does provide these opportunities. And it's harder when it's not there. Thank you.
Let me ask the audience to thank the former RGA and NGA chairman. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you, Jason. Good to see you. Hey, good to see you. It was great fun. Gosh, we fall right back in. We could come back. We could have another round.
Look at this guy. Look at this guy. I mean,
Hey.
no.
Sorry.
You know, they always say Republicans say, "Oh, this guy doesn't even know the word yes."
Yeah. See, I didn't want Bruce. I wanted to get the economy teed up so that.
How are you? I'm good. How's everything?
I want to get Bruce up here so he can brag about how good the economy was in his day and explain what the hell's going on under this new leadership. We don't have these reform Democrats. Well, good to see you. Thanks. Hey. Thank you. Well, you guys are awesome.
Wendell.
I mean, Clarence Harvey was the man back in the day. Thank you.
You're nice to come.
There's a lot of history there.
Yeah, I am. Okay. We're going to get right into the next panel without any delay. So we turn now to from the governor's offices, from the governors of Michigan and Wisconsin, to the Clinton administration, which also played a large role, obviously, in the passage and signing of the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. My name is Robert Dorr, and I'm the Mortgage Fellow in Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, one of the sponsors of this event. And I have to say right up front that seems like everyone in the room, I played no role in the drafting or writing of the original Welfare Reform Act. And I want to also say that we felt it was important, while there will be other events on all kinds of topics associated with this and the current state of events, to talk about the history and politics and process of the signing of this act. And that's what the purpose and inspiration of this event is today. I do have to say one point about where I was, and I was the director of the Child Support Enforcement Office in New York State after the bill was signed. And I can remember the very first briefings when the leaders of the Assembly and the leaders of the governor's office were brought together in the Senate to brief on what the act meant for New York. And I can tell you, I remember every day the look on the faces of the career bureaucrats and Assembly staffers when they saw what was about to happen to New York State. So much of what took place in New York State since then could not have happened if President Clinton had not signed that bill. So I do have a personal vested interest, although I was not, like so many of you here, involved in the signing. To help us understand what was going on in the Clinton administration and what led President Clinton to sign it, we have a distinguished group here. I want to say that I want to be clear and honest with all of you that we reached out to the most important member of the Bill Clinton administration, and unfortunately he could not attend. But we got the second most important member on this issue in Bruce Reed. Bruce Reed is on my far left. He was the former chief domestic policy advisor to President Clinton. He has been the chief of staff to Vice President Biden, and he was the driving force, or one of the driving forces for the bill in the Clinton administration from the White House. Next to Bruce is Will Marshall, who represents one of our co-sponsors, the Public Policy Institute. Will Marshall co-founded the Democratic Leadership Council with Al Fromm in 1985 and launched PPI in 1989. In 1992, he co-edited Mandate for Change, which was the policy blueprint for Clinton's New Democratic Initiative. And along with Lane Kamarick, he wrote the welfare reform chapter. And then finally, and I want to say, this event today is very much emblematic of the old adage that winners write the history. But we have one exception, and that is we have Wendell Primus, who currently is a senior advisor to the Office of the Minority Leader of the United States House of Representatives, but was, during the welfare reform period, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Services Policy at the United States Department of Health and Human Services. And Wendell Primus was one of those three very important top-level officials who, in the wake of President Clinton signing the act, resigned. So we're very glad and appreciative, Wendell, for you to come to this celebration. We asked others. You're not the only one that we reached out to. But as I say, history sometimes gets written by the winners. And maybe that's what this session seems like. So I'm going to start off with Bruce, because, and this may be the most obvious question of all, but it still is debated. And that was, what was the main motivation for President Clinton in signing the first bill? to fulfill the campaign promise, to end welfare as we know it, to put in place big changes which in some would benefit poor Americans that he truly believed in, or to help with the upcoming campaign versus Senator Dole?
Robert, the campaign really wasn't a factor. By that point, Bill Clinton had been leading Senator Dole by 10 points since the State of the Union in January. He was headed for a comfortable win no matter what he did with the bill. Poor Bob Dole never quite recovered from the 2 government shutdowns and a booming economy. So when the president got us together to debate what he should do, whether he should sign it or not, he said, politics is a wash, set that aside, let's talk about the merits. And I think what motivated him was he was from a poor state. He'd seen how much people on welfare wanted to go to work. He really wanted to get something done and end a broken system, replace it with a system that was built on work. And he was pretty happy, actually, given we were dealing with the Congress of the other party, with the welfare reform provisions of the welfare bill. We'd been successful in getting a lot of child care money in the bill. We had real work requirements. We had tough child support enforcement provisions. We had a strong maintenance of effort, as the governors complained. We had performance incentives for states that did well. So the welfare reform part of the bill was quite good in our view. What made the decision more complicated was that Republican Congress had added a couple of poison pills in hopes that the president would veto the bill. They'd included food stamp and immigrant benefit cuts that the president strongly opposed. In the end, he felt that he was pretty confident that he'd be able to restore those benefit cuts in the budget talks in the ensuing year, but that he didn't think that it was at all clear that the historic chance to end welfare as we know it and reform the welfare system would ever come around again. So I think he was determined to keep that campaign promise to end welfare as we know it, a promise that he felt meant as much to people on welfare as it did to the American people.
Bruce, can I just follow up with one question before I go to the next? Do you think that Chairman Shaw viewed the visuals as hoping that he would veto?
No, I don't think so. I think the welfare reform debate in a very contentious couple of year period brought out some of the worst in Washington and some of the best. Some of the worst was that we had actually both sides conspiring to try to stop that bill from happening. Ironically, many Republicans who had advocated for welfare reform for decades trying to add poison pills at the last moment in hopes that it would fall, that it wouldn't get done. And then Democrats Party that had always been the party that put people to work, the party that aspired to lift people out of poverty, having deep reservations about a bill that was actually going to make a serious attempt to do that. In the end, happily, we were able to persuade a majority from both parties to support the bill, and the American people and people on welfare got what they wanted.
Will, give us a sense of what you think led President Clinton and others like him to decide that the old system had to change. And here I want you to talk about values that the old system didn't really endorse, and also evidence, and a work like David Ellwood at Poor Support.
Right. Well, thanks, Robert. And let me also thank you and other partners here for including PPI. It's really important to underscore the bipartisan provenance of this historic bill, and it could not have happened, frankly, without the configuration of political forces that existed in '96. I never thought I would be nostalgic for Newt Gingrich, but strange things happen in politics if you stay in it long enough. Look, I mean, this sort of grew out of the new democratic conversation of change and reform in the Democratic Party that followed the 84 campaign, and loss. And there was really a moment where we were all thinking anew, and even before Bill Clinton came on the scene, people like Chuck Robb, then chairman of the DLC, were giving speeches looking more skeptically at what the war on poverty, which is his stepfather had launched, had wrought over the years, and certainly looking at the evidence that we were losing the initiative in the war on poverty. We saw poverty rising, child poverty rising, family structure unraveling, teenage pregnancy rates rising. And so, the system didn't seem to be working. And, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, I think, rightly gets a lot of credit for the '88 Family Support Act, even though the Republican regime at the time. But we were also looking at that and the jobs program and not seeing much success in moving people from welfare to work on a kind of a training paradigm. Did not seem to be very effective. The results, according to many exhausting manpower demonstration studies that I plowed through, were marginal at best. So I think there was something like a very broad social consensus and political consensus across the spectrum that the status quo in welfare was unsustainable and needed to be changed. Now, we disagreed and eventually fell out over how to change it. But I don't think there was not that many people defending the status quo. There were some sort of diehard folks in our party who said, a little more money for education and training, we'll finally get jobs to work. We never thought that would happen. But I think there's a congealing consensus in the country based on the evidence and the things that the governors were doing. These were heroes of ours. We watched the W2 came later, but we watched the kind of reforms that were happening in Wisconsin and California, the welfare to work moves, enabled by waivers, and were impressed by what we saw, and that all fed the view that we should change. And the second point, it goes to values, and this is very important to Bill Clinton's new democratic renovation of the Democratic Party's philosophy of governing, and that was that the old system seemed not to have positive incentives for work, for strong family formation. It seemed to, as Kimmy Gray, who was in the tenant management movement, very close to Jack Kemp, said, it's a system that rewards you when you fail, but never gives you any positive incentives to succeed. And I think that was certainly, I would say, Bill Clinton's view that, we needed a system that, A, really created the right incentives for the values that are productive, work and family and personal initiative, and always striving towards self-sufficiency. And he also based it on a critique of the entitlement mentality. He knew that, and I think during the campaign he would talk about 2 years and out, that the idea that welfare was in danger of becoming a way of life and needed to go back to being something that was transitional and really a support to people to become independent. So, work first was the mantra. And I do want to say one other thing, Robert, and that is, remember, the first thing he did was not to sign the bill in 1996. The very first thing he did to lay the predicate for a successful social policy revolution, really, was the dramatic expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit in '93, $22 billion expansion. And the reason that was important, because we said, it's immoral to demand that low-income people work if they're going to take jobs that don't pay them enough to lift them out of poverty. So we all said, you have to make work pay first, then you can talk about time limits and ultimately ending the entitlement.
So President Clinton is elected in 1992, and one of the first things he does is he appoints a working group on welfare reform, co-chaired by David Ellwood and Mary Jo Bain and Bruce. And Wendell, you staffed that, and I wondered about your thinking back on the process of that. It was a large group, unwieldy, not maybe a decision-making body. Did you feel like was that a useful exercise, or did you worry that maybe the White House had already made up its mind where it was going?
I think it was a very useful exercise. I did learn a couple things. I had run a similar process on the Hill around the Graham-Rudman Balanced Budget Act, and it was much easier to get 30 people to agree on things than it was to get 30 people in the administration. Now, theoretically, on the Hill, there's 535 bosses, or if you just look at the Democratic side, you would think there would be more disparity. But, and in the administration, you're basically working for one guy, the president. And yes, the vice president is also elected, but, and so you would think there would be easier agreement, but, you had
the Treasury Department, the Agriculture, I mean, everybody thought they had a piece of the action. And so it was very hard to get agreement. Now, I'll say, looking back on it, I think we did some very good things. The child support enforcement provisions that were hammered out by the Clinton administration were basically adopted by Clay Shaw and Ron Haskins and the Republicans. We also had many different working groups. For example, one of the reasons welfare rolls were exploding was because out-of-wedlock births and teen pregnancy rates had been climbing. Now, the question was, how do you turn teen pregnancy rates around? I'm not so sure the welfare reform bill per se, but every year since 1996, save one, teen pregnancy rates have gone down, and as a consequence, the things that feeds the welfare rolls has gone down as a result. I think we also worried a lot about, what Tommy Thompson said about work supports, how much money there should be. And I'll agree with Bruce in the sense that the bill, as finally passed by Congress, had $54 billion of savings associated with it. 44% of those were in the immigrant area, non-citizen area, but legal immigrants. I'm not talking about illegal here. I'm talking about taking benefits away from legal immigrants, and 43% of the cuts were in the food stamp area. It really wasn't what we're talking about today, the time limits and AFDC. And it was those things that drove the analysis that said a lot more kids would be put in poverty, et cetera. But what I wanted to come back to was, I think the work we did lay the foundation from some very good things. And the other thing I'll say about this welfare reform debate, and it's still with us today, and that is 5/6 of the children born out of wedlock or living in single mother families, live with the female. And we give the female the money to take care of the children. So we expect the female side of this equation to be the parents, the caretakers, as well as the breadwinners. And what about the male side? Children don't come into the world automatically. There's a male side to this equation. And the question is, and we have problems with young male unemployment rates today. And the question still remains, and we worked on things like paternity establishment. Usually that male is very proud when the baby is in the hospital. And we got paternity establishment. This was based on work that had been done at the local level. That was the time you find out about paternity establishment, because if the mother goes on welfare at 16 months, 24 months, then you got to track down the guy, you got to establish an order, all of that. And if you can get paternity establishment, you're halfway home. So those were some of the details we worked on.
Wendell, I have to follow up on one thing with you, because you mentioned that the two things that President Clinton spoke very harshly about when he signed it, the immigration provision and the food stamp cuts. And remind me, I don't think I heard it correctly, but was that the reason that you decided to resign, is that he signed a bill with those in it, or was it the giving up of the entitlement?
No, I mean, I think Democrats, it wasn't the entitlement nature, and it wasn't about this condition on work. I mean, Democrats were for work too, despite what some Republicans would tell you. It really was, to my simple way of thinking, if CBO said you save $55 billion, how do you think you're going to be improving child well-being or child welfare? And it really was those things. I did not think that, and Bill Clinton proved me wrong, that the very worst provision in the bill, the worst one, was the fact that we were going to take benefits, SSI benefits, fairly generous by welfare standards, away from legal immigrants who were age 70, who had no prospect of work, and who had been in the country many years. And that was a $12 billion savings. The 1997 Act changed all of that. So the welfare bill, as we know it, never took place. And, I came from the Dan Rostenkowski part of view. You draw a line in the sand. Right. And if you cross that line, you don't sign. So, but
yep. That's very helpful, because President Clinton, in his statement, said, we'll come back and get those things fixed. So my next question, again, coming back to you, Bruce, is the Clinton administration succeeded in passing welfare reform, while it failed on health care reform, an effort that was led by the First Lady at the time, Mrs. Clinton. It seems your approach worked better. What was it about what you did that was better than whatever she was doing?
My office was next to Ira Magaziner, so I always did. They started first, we came second. I always felt like we were the younger sibling learning from watching. But look, it's a lot easier to take on an issue when you're, as we were, when you weren't facing $100 million of industry advertising, where you weren't, the town wasn't crawling with lobbyists who had a financial stake one way or the other. Remember, Pat Moynihan, when he was leading the opposition against the welfare bill, lamented, remembering his time of getting his head handed to him in the next administration when he tried to fight for guaranteed income, that he said, he looked down the streets of Washington and said, where's the lobby to stand up for the poor? So we had plenty of difficult battles, plenty of difficult family feuds, but the American people were with us. The people we were trying to help were with us. The governors critically were with us, and I think it helped that it wasn't a partisan issue. There were unhappy Republicans and Democrats and supportive Republicans and Democrats. I think in retrospect, everybody agreed that if there had been a way to pursue both at the same time, that there was a substantive reason to do that, because as the governors pointed out, the many people leaving welfare face the problem of where they're going to get health care. So that was a policy problem that would have been better solved together. And then I think that for Americans to take a chance on health reform, they needed to be reassured that that government could run a two-car funeral, as Bill Clinton used to say, and the first order of business in proving to them that that government reflected their values and could implement a program well, had to be fixing the welfare system.
Since I have to do this, Bruce, and I didn't tell you in advance I was going to do this, but since we brought up the First Lady and Mrs. Clinton, did she ever wander into your office and say, can we have a little chat about this? I'm going to give you my views on welfare reform, or was she busy with other things?
She did not wander into my office.
Over the course of the 2-year process, there were leaks. So we'll leave it at that, or do you want to add?
I'll take the leak.
Where was Mrs. Clinton? Yeah, you want the leak question? Okay. Over the course of the 2-year process, there were leaks about the administration's plans, and there was a controversy over a report estimating the number of children who would end up in poverty. Was anyone in the administration ever reprimanded for what might be viewed as a kind of lack of organizational discipline? Or did the White House, which had maybe appeared, act like these things happen and overreacting could just make them worse?
Well, I thought those leaks were despicable. As Wendell kind of pointed out, that when you sign up for an administration, that's who you work for. If you have a difference with the president, take that and present it to him or to her, especially if it's a president like Bill Clinton, who welcomed dissenting points of view. He surrounded himself with people with different points of view precisely because he wanted to hear that debate. So having that debate in the press was shameful. Every administration complains about it. I think the fact that we had such a problem with it wasn't a management problem. It was because this was such a tough issue within the Democratic family, and feelings ran really strong. And there were a few times when it was made apparent to some of the administration that maybe they want to straighten up, and most of those didn't seem to work. So.
Thank you. Wendell, you want to comment?
Yeah, so let me begin by saying, to some extent, it was completely authorized in the sense of, in the 1990 budget agreement, I was working for Rostenkowski and the Democrats, and we did a deficit reduction analysis questioning, whether the rich were bearing the pain of deficit reduction or the poor. I mean, deficit reduction by definition is pain. You're raising someone's taxes or cutting someone's services or benefits. And when we lost the majority in the Congress, Leon Panetta was very concerned about all the block granting, not just welfare, but Medicaid, job training, all the block granting that was going to go on. And so I got a call from the OMB chief saying, please replicate that analysis that CBO did. And so that's what we started to do, was when the House passed their giant budget bill, we were expected to look at whether the poor were paying for that deficit reduction or whether the rich. And then I got the bright idea, if I could do that, I could also count the number of children that were moving across this somewhat arbitrary line called the poverty line. So, and I do think as, and policymakers, administration officials do want to know the impact. And when we wrote that initial memo, I made very sure the president knew that 400,000 kids were taken out of poverty because of the EIT changes that were enacted as part of the budget bill. And then, what was the question? What was the welfare impact? And that really was because of the SSI changes and the food stamp changes, et cetera. And I think those estimates were valid. And they didn't leak for a long time. The president showed them. I got a call from Bruce, but they didn't leak for about 6 weeks. And I did not do the leaking. Which is a record.
Turning to maybe a little easier question for the three of you, and Will, you can start off because you brought up the idea that welfare reform was about more than just what we did in TANF, but it also had work supports part of it as well. If you look at the broad agenda, and then we come to the decision on Medicaid. Earlier panel expressed some concern about that, but is it fair to say that helping people retain their health insurance when they go to work was easier with Medicaid not block granted? In other words, that decision may actually have helped the ability of agencies to ensure that when they went to work and went off cash, they could retain some public health insurance.
Well, I think certainly, Democrats felt that way, that it should not be block granted, that it was safer if it were not block granted, and we could make that assurance. The block grant was not Bill Clinton's idea. We hadn't supported it either at the sort of the DLC in the earlier years of groundwork laying on what became the work first kind of architecture. But that was one of the prices that you pay when you enter into a bipartisan negotiation. At the time I learned to love a block grant, a performance-based block grant, one that you can really where you can really hold the actors accountable for achieving the goals laid out in the grant. I don't think we've done that on the TANF grant. That's one of the big problems. I'm sure you'll talk about it later. And I was sorry I didn't have a chance to talk more with the governors about it because, there was an inordinate confidence, I think, in the idea that states would follow the letter and spirit of the 96 bill with the broad grant of responsibility that they got through the block grant, and I don't think that's quite happened. So, yeah, it was not. I don't think many Democrats were down for taking another big risk on Medicaid to go along with the TANF block grant.
Wendell, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I just, I think there was a huge literature in the early 1900s about the welfare trap. The fact that if mothers left welfare, they would lose Medicaid. Governor Thompson was absolutely correct. But with the Affordable Care Act and other changes we have made, that is basically gone. That welfare trap, you can get health insurance now for your kids, whether you're on welfare or off welfare. And I think, the evidence is still, what has become of this welfare reform effort, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's very hard to disentangle the impacts of welfare reform from the other very good things that Bill Clinton did, get a roaring economy, the CHIP program, raising the minimum wage, all of those things. I think slowly, the Affordable Care Act has made a big difference in improving the welfare of kids. And that literature, Larry Mee can correct me on the next panel, that literature is gone.
Bruce, in the history of describing the final decision, the president calls together his top aides, including most of the cabinet, Secretary Rubin, Mickey Cantor, Donna Shalala, yourself. In his press conference before, he said, I had to do it. They signed it last night. I had to call them together. And after I did a little work around the house, I don't know if you ever read that, he said, I called them all over. And you were there, and you did the final briefing for him, as the final word, and pros and cons, and advocated it, despite the fact, by the way, that only one cabinet official was supportive, Mickey Cantor. The first, I want to know, could you just give us a little sense of that meeting? And most importantly, you know, we're around politicians a lot, some of us, and they're not all that well deeply grounded in the details of particular issues. Where is President Clinton on the, I mean, does he know, did he give you the sense that he knew more about this than maybe his assistant secretary in the HHS or people that, no, I didn't mean that, Wendell, about you, but I meant just generally, give us a sense of him as a policy person.
Well, that was one of the great joys of working with him on domestic policy, was that I always knew that he would know more than I did. It was most profound on this particular issue because he'd been a national leader on it from the time he'd come to the governorship. He'd been in more welfare offices than any other governor. He'd led the governors in writing the Family Support Act. So he had an intuitive feel for this that that nobody else in town could touch. And I vividly remember another meeting in the cabinet room long before when Wendell and David and Mary Jo Bain and the Welfare Task Force briefed the president at the end of or middle of '94 on what we found. And David and Mary Jo really wanted to have that meeting to make sure that the president was up to speed. And the conversation got started, and the president asked them about, did you see the latest MRDC report on the Riverside experiment and welfare at work? And what do you think about that? And they were so happy, they couldn't believe it, that that he was the best student they'd ever had.
He may have known a lot before he got to be their student.
Yes, he did. And he also understood, part of what, what matters in these things is understanding how it's going to really work when it gets out there to the states. So Bill Clinton understood that that a welfare block grant, if it was well funded, wasn't the end of the world, because the welfare entitlement at the state level wasn't worth that much. States could set benefits as low as they wanted to under the old way. But a Medicaid block grant would be just misery for poor kids, because when that pot of money was in front of the state legislature, the nursing home lobby would come in and take a big share for long-term care, and there wouldn't be much left to provide health care for poor kids. And I guarantee you, there wasn't a welfare academic in the country who understood that dynamic. So it was when we got to the meeting in the cabinet room where he wanted to hear everybody's point of view, I think he was genuinely torn about the pros and cons of the overall package, and he was ticked off that that the Republican leadership had sent him a bill on an issue that they should have supported, hoping that he would veto it. So what I remember most about that meeting is simply that everybody recognized the historic importance of the decision, that none of us knew what the outcome would really be, but usually meetings around the cabinet room table, people are pounding their fists and overstating their case, this was the most composed I've ever seen a debate like this. I mean, even Rahm passed in that debate. He was violently for it, but he didn't weigh in. I think people recognize that they didn't want to sell the president a bum steer on this. And so we just said what we honestly thought. And he didn't decide in that room. He, like most things with President Clinton, the decision went into overtime. We went into the Oval Office. We had all the same arguments again. Eventually, someone pointed out that the House needed a signal because they were going to vote on it. And so he said, okay, let's do it.
Well, he says in some one of the reports, or maybe it's in his book, says he went in and saw the vice president, and he wanted the vice president to say where he was, and he had to press the vice president a little bit.
Yeah, the vice president didn't want to make. I think it's one of those decisions where that's what the president gets paid for, and he was going to have. It was clear he was going to have to live with the outcome no matter what. And what President Clinton said after he came back from announcing it was how you never know how sure you are about a decision until you hear yourself say it. And as he made the case for it in the press room, I think he became more and more convinced that it was the right.
It's a great statement. I urge all of you to Google it and see the president's statement when he announced that he was going to sign it. Last question, and because I know we have a tough panel coming up. In his statement to the press that we just talked about, after signing, President Clinton said 100% of the people with strong views on both sides recognized and respected the power of the arguments on the other side. And I also want to point out that when the House did the final vote, when the final speech was made by the chair, subcommittee chair, Clay Shaw, he went across and gave his final remarks from the Democratic side of the House in an effort to reach out. And we haven't mentioned just the extent to which it was an overwhelming bipartisan vote. But my question now we'll talk about today is that been lost? And Wendell, you want to go first?
Yeah. Well, I think over the last 20 years, it's a little hard to make the case that there is less partisanship. Clearly, there is more. And I guess I'll use my example of the Affordable Care Act. I mean, the evidence that it is working from survey data, from administrative data, we have lowered the number of uninsured by 20 million at least. We have driven healthcare costs to their lowest increases ever. And, when you look at the 50 times that the demise of ACA has been debated on the House floor, the evidence from the other side is really, I think, lacking. So I think we ought to engage in more bipartisan bills. We have some big problems in this country dealing with the demographic bulge, and it makes sense that there be less partisanship, but there clearly is not. And I think we've got to return to evidence and having talks across the aisle to address some of our very severe problems.
Bruce or Will?
Well, I would say that let's not romanticize the political landscape of the 90s. It was very difficult, and there was a lot of bitter partisanship then as well. I think what made welfare reform possible and some other progress then, and what could make it happen now, is that President Clinton was a big believer in principled compromise. He recognized that if you're going to get something done, both sides had to come away feeling like it was a fair deal, and that neither side had a monopoly on the truth, and that it was important to take the best ideas from both sides, not kill each other trying to stop the other side's ideas from happening. And I think that spirit is still, deep inside the hearts of most of the people who work here. The incentives in the political system work against it. There's a ever increasing feedback loop. If you try to say anything interesting, you get shot down quicker now than you did then. So it takes a lot more steel and spine, but the payoff is big. We have enormous problems that aren't going to get solved any other way, and I think there's every time I've seen it where Republicans and Democrats worked together and got behind closed doors and actually talked to each other about what the real problems were and what they might do to solve it. There's a, there's a revelation that comes to all of them that that maybe we're not nearly as bad as the American people think we are. Maybe there isn't any problem that we can solve.
I'm under strong instructions from the rest of my panels.
Can I get in?
Yes, oh, I'm sorry. As our co-sponsor, I apologize.
Well, yeah, that's all right. But I want to make a point about the political impact of all this. I mean, what's different then from now was behind, and it was very fractious. I was kidding about being nostalgic for Newt. But, what lay behind that was a social consensus. That is a broad public consensus that the status quo in social policy was broken. It wasn't just the welfare system. It was also inner city schools. It was also the public housing system, child support. We saw it broken in a lot of ways. And, the great novelty here is a Democratic president led the way to changing it. Nixon to China, to use Doug Besherov's analogy. But it was the politics and the substance converged here. First of all, it had to be changed because it wasn't working for poor people. Secondly, it had to be changed because it wasn't working for the people we were asking to pay the bills, that is, U.S. taxpayers who had no confidence in it. As a result of that, welfare had been this terrible, toxic wedge issue in the middle of American politics for a generation, my formative generation of politics, from Nixon's campaign on. Ronald Reagan famously did wonderful things with welfare queens. And by the time Bill Clinton came along, the New Democrats came along, we were sick of this and, decided that, this system's not working, we're not going to defend it, and we've got to realign social policies so that first, it helps the people it's intended to help, and secondly, it can win the support of the American people. And it was a gamble. We weren't sure this was going to work out as well as it did, even though there are problems which you'll get to later. But it was worth taking that gamble, and welfare's disappeared from the public debate. Now, there's some people who, namely Republicans, who try to resurrect it every 4 years and try to find some way to get the old welfare bugaboo back into it. Mitt Romney made a half-hearted effort at that, frankly, 4 years ago. But the public doesn't feel it anymore. They're no longer aggrieved about a social policy that they're asking to pay for that they don't think works. That's a fundamental difference, and I don't think anybody should be ashamed of bringing the substance and the policy together to improve the system, not to cure it for all time, but to make a definite improvement.
Thank you very much. I hope our audience will thank the audience. We have a great panel coming up. Thanks very much.
Thank you. This is a panel from the perspective of Congress.
I mean, we just heard a fair amount of disinformation appear in this panel. But they're very honest in believing what they just said.
Yeah. No, I think so, yeah.
This is a panel of the winners. We don't have a Wendell on this panel. My name is Mickey Kaus. I covered welfare reform for the New Republic back in the day, or I thought I was covering it. I saw the Democratic side, not so much the Republican side, so I have a lot to learn here. My job mainly consists of calling up Ron Haskins on the phone, and he would say, "Oh, I have this big problem, but I'm going to take care of it." And it seemed like Ron never lost. It was pretty extraordinary. And also, I learned that every other reporter in town was doing exactly the same thing. So it's not like I had a special access to Ron. He controlled the entire press corps of Washington. So we really have a good panel from the congressional perspective. We have Ron, who took what Mr. Weaver in his welfare history calls a panel of low salience in Congress, on a subcommittee of Ways and Means, where basically people went when they were freshmen and they wandered into the wrong committee, and they were assigned to that, and he took that and produced the major piece of legislation of the Clinton administration. We have Robert Rector, who at the Heritage Foundation was the prime mover of a lot of the forces that led to the bill. Somebody once described he's powered by his own source of nuclear power. So he's basically unstoppable. And Senator Talent, who as a member of Congress, if you read Ron's book, the sentence that comes after the anecdote that Jason Turner said about Senator Talent being worried about Castle was, you can get a lot done if you work with men like Congressman Talent. So he was also obviously a very important player, had his name on the bill that was the chief alternative to the contract bill. So I'd like, this is basically a historic session, but I'm sure we'll get into fights. I hope you fight amongst yourselves, because I'm not going to be able to do it. I'd like to partition it into before the contract, after the
That's why
contract.
I sat in between Robert and.
All right, okay. Let's, the first period was from wherever, the mid-'80s, wherever you want to start, to the contract. How did we get there? What do you think the key elements were? And as a sort of moderator's gimmick, if you throw in what you think your worst, at some point in the proceedings, throw in what you think your worst mistake you made was. And you can then throw in the most brilliant move you made was. But if you have an opportunity to throw that in, please throw that in. Ron, start with you.
I think the most important thing about the run-up to welfare reform, actually, I don't remember exactly how it started. There were a few members who were interested in welfare reform, and it was not a topic that anybody was talking about. This, of course, is even before Clinton was president. The Republicans started talking on the Ways and Means, started talking about welfare reform, and we had jurisdiction over most of the big programs, so it was always a natural topic. And then I think when Clinton was elected, several members noticed that whenever he was behind, especially in the Midwest, in the polls, he would haul out welfare reform. And it worked. So there was a lot of, I would call it almost jealousy that here's a Democrat who's making time, talking about welfare reform. And I think it turned out to be important later because it showed the idea that he did it primarily for political reasons. I personally never believed that. Clay Shaw, who was eventually chairman of the subcommittee and was, I would think, the most important Republican in welfare reform, other than Robert Rector, of course, and almost a tie with Jim Talent, but he was on a somewhat more illustrious committee. Here's what I think happened as we build up the bills for welfare reform, H.R. 3500 and a series of bills, was first that we developed a team of experts. Now, you will be amazed to hear that a lot of Republicans could not spell AFDC. They didn't know anything about welfare reform. And so it was very important that we develop a team of people who really knew what they were talking about, and people like Shaw, Jim Talent, definitely, I think probably the most informed person. Cass was pretty impressive too, but Jim Talent, that I'll bet you a nickel you didn't know much about it before we got into this debate, but he was a fast learner, and we had several like that. So that was an important thing. Second thing was we worked out doing a policy and passing a bill in the Congress depends on lots of relationships. I think that's one reason that we have trouble passing bills now. And these relationships developed over 3, 4, 5 year period among both the members and the staff. So we had a well-oiled machine by the time we took over the House after the election of 1994. And then third was learning the substantive issues, writing the legislation, learning about the statutes that were already in place and what we really wanted to do. And finally, I think the most important thing was that we found out where we disagreed. And we knew going in we were going to have a big problem with heritage and that Robert was going to be breathing down our necks the whole time. And it turned out Bill Bennett was like that too. I mean, there were definitely cracks in the Republican Party. It's not like we all, singing Kumbaya and we got the same ideas. We had some big differences within the Republican Party, and we learned what they were and started developing solutions before we were in the limelight.
Robert, I think this is an invitation to you because I remember it was stunning to me when you and Heritage came in with the illegitimacy agenda. I thought everybody was all happy and going to pass a nice workfare bill.
Right. This is what I would say the history of how this welfare reform came about. It started with Ronald Reagan. Back when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, he wanted to make AFDC parents work in exchange for their benefits, and HHS kind of blocked him from doing that. And when he got into the White House, Ronald Reagan, year after year, sought one thing, which was a work requirement for AFDC mothers. And that got blocked by a Democratic Congress year after year. And his second term, Reagan had an advisor who I believe is really the forerunner of welfare reform. He created this. He's been mentioned. His name was Chuck Hobbs. And Chuck Hobbs said, you know, we are not going to get what we want, which is a real work requirement for AFDC moms through a Democratic Congress. So I'm going to do an end run. I'm going to invent this thing called waivers, okay? And the point of waivers, as Chuck explained it to me, was not because he believed that all the wisdom was out in the states. Chuck wanted and Reagan wanted workfare for AFDC moms. But what Chuck said is I get 50 waivers, I'm going to get 2 states that run good work programs. And those 2 states will allow us to overcome the fundamental objections to workfare, which are it's going to create lots of poverty. And moreover, the standard mantra back then, which you guys suffered from too, was, oh my goodness, a work system costs much more than the status quo, therefore you can't do it, can you? And that really had blocked efforts to reform here. And Chuck said, we have to break through that. We have to show that that is absolute nonsense. And all I need to do that is 2 states. And he got them, Wisconsin and Oregon, okay? And that enabled us to set the ground to say it's not true that a work-based system is more expensive than a handout system. And so Chuck set the waiver process in place, but in place to lead to national work requirements. Then along came Clinton. Clinton took up Ronald Reagan's lines. He understood them perfectly. He understood that they were overwhelmingly popular with the public, as your polling showed at that time, and he took over the issue. And meanwhile, the Bush administration was sitting there saying, waivers, waivers, waivers. Bush allowed Clinton to take away Reagan's issue from him, allowed Clinton to flank him on the right. From my perspective, that's the issue that put Clinton in the White House in '92, took it right from Ronald Reagan, maybe with a little Arkansas spin on it, and put him in there. And then what happened was you guys didn't do welfare reform. You did gays in the military, you did Hillary Care, and the public was getting festering and upset about this. When you did try to do your bill, you ran into this stupid budget rule, okay? CBO said that anything you did was going to cost more than the status quo, and so every bill up to the contract from America, the work requirements didn't take place until you were outside the budget window, right? You're 8, 9, 10 years out before the actual work requirements occur so that you can get beyond this ridiculous CBO score. I can't emphasize how very important that was and how this issue shaped out. And one of the things that we did in the summer of '94 was, first of all, we said we're going to block grant AFDC so it doesn't matter what CBO says it costs, but also to just convince the Republican Party that CBO was full of it, okay? And that the standard conventional wisdom from the big Beltway bandits at that time, which was MDRC says that if you put a work program in, it'll reduce the caseload by 5% over 2 years. I knew from my experience in going back 15 years, I could get a 90% reduction in the AFDC UP program in about 2 months with a work requirement that in fact it would cause the caseload to go down rapidly and would save money. And that allowed us to get past the sort of budgetary hurdle that you guys were still stuck with, and the Republican bills were also stuck with that, leading up to the contract with America. The worst, stupidest thing I ever did was to tell Jim Talent that it was he was wasting his time to work on the contract with America, and he should ignore it. I'm glad he didn't.
Senator?
From my perspective, I think the coming together, the proximity in town, but also in time, of really able people across, well, since I'm in this group, maybe I shouldn't say really able, but people across town in the scholarly community, politicians, governors, who actually cared about what was happening in lower income America. Now, everybody cares here in the sense that if they could snap their fingers and make things better for poor people, they would. But cared in the sense of which is meaningful in this town, which is I'm willing to take some risks. I'm willing to examine some of my presuppositions about all this. I'm willing to spend some money. I'm willing to go a little bit out on a limb and make it a priority over time and see what emerges. And I have to tell you, I don't think I'm not a guy who runs Washington down a lot. I was here a long time. I actually liked almost all of my colleagues. But I think that's unusual, and it went on for a long time. The foundation was laid by a lot of good writing across the spectrum, from Charles Murray, Alice Rivlin, Reischauer, Larry Mead, a lot of people, Bruce and others, and I think it. So we all kind of got together, and I was in, I don't know how many, now obviously I was a second-term congressman. It was mostly, I didn't deal directly with the administration except on a few instances, but it was mostly Republicans in the House. But, we talked about Clay, but, Santorum and Camp and Nancy Johnson and Tim Hutchinson, and I mean, there's so many names. And people were really trying to figure out what would work. From our perspective on the Republican side, and I think a lot of Democrats felt this way too, the two best anti-poverty programs that have gotten, the programs that have gotten Americans out of poverty for generations are work and marriage, basically. And what we've done is condition assistance to poor people on them not engaging in that. And that's an oversimplification. But we felt that was a problem, and we wanted to fix it. I have to make a comment about that. One of the most frustrating things for me in both the House and the Senate was see how many promising policies, or policies that we really should have discussed, never got off the ground because of CBO or OMB, okay? I'm sorry if you work for one of those organizations. This is an example. When we did the Community Renewal Act, which was a follow-up to this, and it was Floyd Flake and J.C. Watts and I, which the president signed in 2000 and said was going to bring the benefits of capitalism to the poor. Actually, it was the only signing ceremony I ever attended. I went over there for that. But we introduced this bill, which was designed to renew distressed communities in a lot of places around the country. It wasn't a huge thing. It was a lot of pilot programs, some other things, new market tax credits. And the press said, how much is it going to cost? And I said, okay, we have a score and I'm going to give it to you. But I want everybody to step back and ask yourself this question. Do you think this bill will really help to renew the worst and most distressed communities in the country? Okay? If you don't think that, then you don't want to support the bill. Fine, okay? If you do think that, how can it cost money? I mean, think about it. How can it end up costing us money if we're going to bring all these neighborhoods? It can't. I don't care what CBO says. I don't care what OMB says. It can't cost money, right? And the big, I don't know if I call it a mistake, the regret was that we were never able to take the out-of-wedlock birth rate issue and capsulize it in a legislative agenda that represented it as well as the work requirements represented the work issue, and still haven't to this.
So there was a welfare bill that was part of the contract with America that the Republicans ran on and won on in '94. Then all eyes turned to Congress, and there's a history that follows that, which culminates in Clinton vetoing Congress's product twice, once as part of a budget bill, once as a standalone, and then something happens to get the Republicans to start it up again and produce a bill that he could sign. So, and at some point the governors weigh in and lobby for devolution. Perhaps as some unidentified aide in Congress said, they wanted Congress to leave the money on a stump in the middle of the night in a forest so they could take it. But luckily, this person was too self-effacing to ever have his name identified with this quote. But Ron, do you want to talk about the post-contract history?
Yes. A lot of things happen. A big difference going in, and it accounted for some of the conflicts on the Republican side, was that Clay Shaw and Republicans always wanted to pass a bill, and Santorum, I swear, had been there 30 seconds, and he wanted to pass a bill. So that was always a big part of our thinking. There were other people that wanted to make a political point. They wanted to show the president was a wimp and all kinds of other things. They wanted to contrast between Republicans and the president, and we wanted to close the gap so we could pass a bill. And so that conditioned our thinking a lot. Republicans were clinically depressed after the second time that they didn't sign the bill. I mean, there was a big, people thinking, oh, what's next? And we've done all this work, sent it through twice. And what really happened that kick-started it, now there are other underlying factors here that take a while to talk about, but the kickstart came from the governors. It just so happened that the NGA was in town, I think it was February, right at the beginning of February, and And they had a plan. It was bipartisan. And so I talked to Shaw and Archer and said, call Gingrich. We want on this. We'll have to modify it. It's never going to pass. Robert Rector will hate it. Heritage will hate it. But it's going to get us off the mat. We can get rolling. And that's exactly what happened. I see you want me to stop. So I will.
No, didn't it have, we have 10 minutes to go, so we have to be quick. But didn't it have to do with Dole's flagging fortunes? In other words, Dole wanted the issue versus Clinton, so he was happy with the veto.
No, it wasn't
leaving
just
it
Dole.
as it is.
That was a factor that became a factor, and the Republicans were great on the Ways and Means Committee. They requested a meeting with Newt and told him straight up that our bill and achievements by the Republican Revolution, which hadn't done anything, is way more important than Dole's candidacy. Let him worry about his candidacy. We're going to pass this bill. So that's what we did.
Robert?
I think, I just want to jump in. When Bruce said the president didn't take the campaign into account, I never thought that was a big part of Clinton's. And I think people from the outside look at this and they see a sort of linear connection. Of course, politicians are always thinking politically. You have to, because if you don't have a sustainable political base for what you're trying to achieve, you can't achieve it. Successful politicians understand. I never blame, I was not. Remember, I was a second-term congressman. I wasn't sitting at the leadership tables when they were making these tactical decisions. I never thought we sent it over there hoping he would veto it so that Dole could win the election. And I know I have been in enough of those tables to know it just doesn't. I don't care what happens on TV. That is not what, you know. And I never thought that the president said, "Oh, I'm going to lose the election unless I mean, just stop and think about this for a minute. Of course, in the back of his mind, he may have said to himself, "Well, this probably makes the next 3 weeks or a month a little easier," or something like that. But I just wanted to ring and say, it's just not how they make decisions. Not 99 times out.
Robert, do you agree?
I agree, and the fact that Dole had been very weak on welfare reform only the fact that Dole had been very weak on welfare reform had basically bungled it during his election bid, only reinforced that.
I mean, I find it hard to believe, as maybe it's because I'm a political reporter and we don't like to grant sincerity to anybody, but if Dole had been doing better and it had been 50 to 49, 50 to 49.5, Clinton Dole, I can't believe Republicans would have done the same thing.
I think that would have influenced it, but I mean, he wasn't. He also, I mean, he managed to tick a lot of people off. He had been an impediment in the Senate. He ran horribly on it in the campaign. I mean, what he did in the campaign for when he was running for the president, he said, "Oh, they came up with this big." They did a focus group and everything, and they found that people really liked drug testing for welfare recipients, and this polled really well, okay? So he said, okay, so they're going to have this big, we're going to do drug testing for welfare recipients, but Dole, Dole was a big states flexibility guy. So Dole says, okay, and they have a big press conference and they roll this out. You probably remember this. And they roll this out, big new initiative, and we're going to require drug testing, except it will be a state option. At which point Clinton says within 3 minutes, he says, okay, you can have a waiver. And their whole welfare thing just collapses. You couldn't.
And as for pushing on a veto, of course, in that kind of a dynamic, you have your list of things that you want, and the exchanges to that point should have given you a pretty good idea what the president and his people are going to have heartburn over. So, of course, you are going to push him as far to the edge. The fact that he really had to think about it shows that we made good judgments and put a lot in there that he had to gag on before, because there were things we wanted that we knew he didn't want. That's how the dynamic works. It doesn't mean we wanted him to veto it. It means we thought, well, you know what, we can put him in a position where we can get some things we want that we couldn't have gotten any other way. And I'm sure that was the dynamic.
Let me make a quick point. It won't be more than a minute. I think this is a really crucial thing, and it would be helpful to teach it to staff and members today. And that is, you are going to have at least 9 out of 10 bills. You're going to have serious internal conflicts. And the party that is really a good party can master those, can contain them, and can hold their votes. I went through and I counted the votes in committees, subcommittees, on the floor, Republicans were a machine, even though there were a lot of hard feelings sometimes. And we always retained our votes. That's how come we were able to pass the bill.
And this is a good last question, and also a good segue to the next panel. Jason said I could ask this one question, which is, are you happy with the way governors have handled devolution under the bill? I mean, Chuck Hobbs, I think, was right. The problem isn't that one size doesn't fit all. One size probably would fit all if we knew what the size was. And have any of the governors, taking this new authority that you gave them, done enough to find out what the size is?
I would say I couldn't possibly be more disappointed with governors. The act really has three lessons to it. It had federal work requirements. To the extent for the first 5 years under the act, when the federal work requirements were pushing the governors forward, the caseloads fell rapidly, employment increased, things were changing. By the time the governors met those standards, they then fell into stasis. And today, as we speak, in the average state, 55% of the TANF caseload is sitting at home doing absolutely nothing. Why is it 55%? Because that's what the federal standards require, that you can't go below that. Okay? So the extent that the act succeeded, it was because of the federal requirements. The opposite picture of that was that on the question of marriage, all we got was that three of the four major goals of the act were to increase marriage and reduce non-marital childbearing. We have now spent $600 billion on an act where 3 out of the 4 goals were to promote marriage, and what did we get from the states? One immeasurably small marriage program in one state after 20 years. I really don't have good opinions about state welfare bureaucracies, but they came in way below even my expectations. The final point, though, that's really important is people always talking about, did we spend enough on TANF? The other thing that TANF did was freeze federal funding in real terms. Now, any state, any liberal state, if they wanted to run a big AFDC-type cash welfare program, they could do that, but they would have to pay for it with state money, not with federal money. And what you find is after 20 years, even the most liberal states have not done that. They've all kept their caseloads low, with the exception of Oregon, all kept their caseloads low because to do otherwise would force them to spend real money. Federal money is not real money to them, but their money is real, and they're much more prudent in the way that they spend their money. That is a real federalist lesson. Collecting money in Washington and dumping it on the states is not federalism. Making these state governments spend their own money on welfare, they're not going to be conservatives, but they're going to be much more frugal than if it's Washington money.
So here's the problem. At the time, the block grant was a good idea. It really shook things up. It gave the governors like Tommy Thompson and Engler and others a lot of control, and they used it wisely. Robert just said the first 5 years, I'll go with that. But then it turned out that the governors became enmeshed in politics. What a shock. And they had a lot of pressures. They had to do something about their child protection caseload. They had to do something about daycare. They had to give scholarships for college. So they're pulled in all different directions. We gave them the flexibility. It was poorly drafted. I was involved in drafting. I'll say that frankly. And so they had tons of flexibility. But we're still in charge. We still write the statutes. Why in the hell aren't Republicans doing something? This problem has been obvious for a long time. It could be changed. So, for example, we could change tomorrow the statute that the governors can only spend TANF on cash welfare and work programs. That's it. Nothing else. And I think that would be a great improvement. I know Robert liked to put marriage in there, but
Take the first part out, cash welfare. They can spend it on work programs.
no,
Got a deal.
I don't think that's funny. We have to have a great nation has a cash welfare program. That's, I mean,
I think we have not had, and when I went back into the Senate and we did the reauthorization and we did some things, and I said at the time, I was disappointed because we had a wave for about 10 years of governors who were willing to take risks, to challenge things from different perspectives. And we saw 2 of them today. They mentioned Bill Weld, Evan Bayh, Keene did some of this. I mean, there was a lot of governors out there. And you just, you're just not hearing that. I don't want to do a disservice to any who are out there doing this. It's just nobody's asking themselves, if you really want to help folks in this situation, it's a question both of changing the incentive structure so that they do take more responsibility for their lives, but also giving them the kind of outside assistance that enables them to do that and gives them hope they can do it. I used to say to people when we have these debates, what kind of package do we want to help the poor? Well, what would you do if it was your little sister? You'd make certain her needs were met. You would provide her with encouragement, but you would also say, look, there's some things you're going to have to do. There's some changes and decisions in your own life you're going to have to. It's exactly how anybody would treat somebody that they cared about. So what the problem is, how do you recreate that through the processes of government? It is technically very difficult. You're not going to do it through a straight bureaucratic model, but you're not going to do it just by changing the incentives and letting people pull themselves up by the bootstraps. So you have to find other ways, and that requires a lot of effort and search across and innovative governors. You can't, we can do pilot programs up here, and I've done that. The pilots about, the states are an ongoing pilot program. And really we do need more innovative governors to do more from both right of center and left of center, and really to push their own groups who will tell them, you can't change anything, because if you change anything, the poverty rates will go way up. You got to push and do some things. So I would agree. I'm disappointed.
We've unaccountably ended it on time. So if you have questions, you'll have to save them for the next panel. Thank you to this panel.
I probably took it. Is that it? Your example.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good. Yep. Thanks.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
I don't see it. Jason's. No.
Jason's got his own.
Yeah, sure. We're not on time. Okay. I gotta go figure out how to get a cab.
We'll get you in a cab, Eloise. We'll take care of you.
Okay.
Do we have an extra chair? I don't have to sit down here.
I saw you actually.
Oh, he's fine. Okay. I was gonna say, isolate me.
Andrew, do you have any water?
Oh, yeah,
You
sure.
can have mine.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
Okay, Andrew, I'm fine.
Yeah, he was good.
Well,
tonight.
as is always said,
Do that, Eloise, you got to.
this panel is between you and the reception.
The first place to
So be nice to us, because we know the chef. I am Doug Besheroff, and I teach at the University of Maryland. I want to thank especially the last panel for setting up this panel. We have a small panel. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's grew. We have a small panel, and we have all of 30 minutes. So here's what we're going to do. I'm not going to introduce them. Number 2, except for a couple of sentences, I'm hardly going to say anything. I'm just going to get out of the way, but I'm going to tell you what the assignment was. The last panel, besides, again, all this reminiscing, was, geez, we got to do a better job in the future. So the assignment to this panel is, tell us what we should do in the future. We're going to start with the staff director of the House Ways and Means Subcommittee on Human Resources, and Cesaro, who is Ron Haskins' successor times 1, with one in the middle, Matt Weiniger, who couldn't be here. Yeah. And then we're going to go right down the list. And because she's a big shot, and because this is her home, gets 10 minutes.
Oh.
Everyone else gets 5 minutes. Anyone who ends a little earlier gets our love and appreciation. But at 5 minutes, because I do have to keep this to end roughly on time, we're going to start going, And thank you very much. You're on.
All right. Well, thank you. Yes, to follow, Ron raised the bar when he had this job. Matt raised it again, and Ron raised it again in the last panel. So I think we've heard that we certainly have our work cut out for us these days. Someone referenced earlier the fact that there's been a discussion draft out there. There has been some kind of movement, but really in the last 10 years we haven't done a major reauthorization of the TANF program, and so that's something we're struggling with and trying to figure out and work in a bipartisan way to do. And so I'm going to kind of set up where we are now and kind of what we see kind of going forward at the committee and through the speaker's efforts as well. So, in the last 2 years, we released a discussion draft that we worked in a bipartisan way and got a lot of feedback. And there's still a lot of thoughts on both sides about how this program should operate, how it has played out, what the role has been of states, what the role of the federal government should be. And so that debate continues. And so the work first nature of it maintains, but that debate about education and training and what role that should play, is the top of that mound. And that's not something we've been able to kind of break through at the subcommittee or at the committee or in the Congress. And so we started from the bottom up in the last year or so and looking at kind of what pieces could we pick off to kind of put TANF back in the box. I think the last panel did a nice job of segueing into where we are today in that, what are states using their money for? They're using it for a bunch of different purposes. Are they focusing on individuals under 200% of poverty? Not all of them. And so what can we do to kind of get it back to its core purpose? But in doing that, there are a lot of good lessons that we have learned. And when TANF was created in 1996, when all the debates were going on about welfare reform, ultimately it was about just one program at the end of the day. There were lots of discussions about Medicaid, about food stamps, things like that. But ultimately they really only reformed one program. And so where we kind of are, and through the Speaker's task force on poverty, opportunity, and upward mobility, we've really been focusing on what does that mean going forward. And so some of you may be familiar with the welfare state chart that the committee has put out, which demonstrates the 80 plus different programs that make up the welfare state. And those programs haven't been touched. Those programs haven't been focused on helping folks move from where they are to where they need to be and where they want to be. I think we heard a lot about that today too. And so the progress that has been made over the last 20 years has also opened our eyes to what we need to do next. And that means going beyond TANF. That means strengthening relationships, again, with the Child Support Enforcement Program. What are other ways in which the lessons that we learned from TANF about establishing paternity, setting expectations, can be applied to other programs within our safety net that include maybe food stamps or housing, or how do we engage fathers? And I think Wendell brought that up too. It's also about looking at, other programs and how they're expecting work or not necessarily expecting work at this time, and how those things all fit together. And so for those of us at the Ways and Means Committee, we really kind of have 4 welfare reform themes that we see guiding us going forward to not only apply the lessons of TANF, but to reapply them to TANF and to the larger safety net kind of across programs. And one, it really continues to be expect work in exchange for benefits. Preparing for work, going to work, doing something, that activity, that getting up, getting out of the house. We heard a lot about that today. That piece remains and is a big part of what should be a basis for our programs. The second part of that is getting the incentives right. I think we heard that on the last panel. It's not just incentives for states, it's incentives for individuals, it's incentives for nonprofits to engage in the process. It's making sure the financial incentives are there for folks to do the right thing so that we can take our hands off and let them go and do what it is that they do best. And that goes along with kind of our third theme, which is focusing on the results of our welfare program. We've come a long way, and something that was kind of alluded to early on and was part of what happened in the 1980s and 90s was a lot about evaluation. The waivers weren't just, hey, go, do this other thing, but it's like, go do this other thing, let's study it, let's understand it, let's see what the impacts are, and let's learn from it. Well, now we've come to a point 20 years later where we are much more effective at doing evaluation. They're much quicker at turning the results around and making that a consistent part of how it is that we do public policy. Everyone likes to talk about evidence-based decision making, but embedding it in the way that we do our business. And so that goes along with the incentives. And so you can actually set up things to create the incentives through the evaluation. And fourth, improving the integrity so that these programs are there for those that truly need them the most. And so I think Senator Talent talked about it in the last panel, making sure that needs are met for those that do need them. But we also need to make sure the integrity of the program is there so that we're keeping those who aren't necessarily eligible, because we do have limited resources. States may think that money comes from the sky, but in fact it doesn't. It comes from hardworking taxpayers every day. And we owe it to them to make sure that we're spending their money properly. And so when we kind of bring all of those things together, along with some of the pieces that our folks over at other committees working on education and training and things like that, you create a system that helps to support families. Today we've talked a lot about a program. From where we sit and where we think about these issues, it's about a system. Because a family does not walk into a welfare office and say, I need this program. They walk in and they have trouble. They can't pay their electric bill. They can't get their kids to school on time because they don't have transportation and they need to get to work and they have all these other things. They don't care what these programs are, and so that's our responsibility to make it work for families that are out there. And so I think I'm under time, but I just want to point out that we're making progress on TANF. We hope, folks will remain engaged in the conversation that we're having and what we've been doing on a bipartisan basis, trying to take TANF out of the appropriations process where it's been just straight extensions with a few minor changes and really regain the program, and that's a priority of Chairman Brady's. And then to also look and take a bigger, a wider view at what's going on with the rest of our safety net.
And thank you very much. Notwithstanding what it looks like, we're actually not going to go in the order that this panel looks like. We had a meeting and talked about this.
Flexibility.
Yes. Flexibility, yes, and state choice and so forth. So the next speaker is Eloise Anderson.
Oh. I thought you were coming down.
At your request, you
Okay. Well, in Wisconsin, we're trying to actually go at that issue called let's try to do two-parent families. And I'd like to get people to think about, we don't believe that there's anybody in our caseload who has had an immaculate conception. So because we don't believe that, and we believe that most of the children come with another parent attached to them somewhere, that we really want to go after fathers. And so what we've done is looked at one of the goals in TANF is to try to put families together. So we are looking at non-custodial fathers really hard. So we've put in 3 programs to be able to do that. One is and all of them provide some kind of subsidy to men. Now I know that's kind of unusual because most of these guys really do need subsidized employment. And a couple of things that we found out about it is that when we get guys jobs, many of them get married. So it ought to say something to us that men don't marry when they don't have jobs. And that if we can get them employment, they tend to form families. And the other side of that is women don't marry men who don't have jobs. So it's kind of critical that we try to figure out how to get men jobs. But we also found out that just getting them jobs is not enough. We also need to figure out, because many of them come to us having been in the child welfare system, having been in prison, and having a lot of trauma in their life. So they also need the kind of support systems we usually give to women, but we don't give to men. So we need to put those kind of support systems much more clinical. They also need, and I know some of you are not going to like this, they need spiritual development because many of them have no faith at all, and they need some. The other one is communication skills, and my favorite is math skills. And one of the reasons why we focus on math skills is because within Wisconsin, one of the things the jobs that are going untapped are infrastructure jobs, plumbers, electricians, carpenters, construction workers, and machinists and welders. All those require the same set of skills: math, algebra, geometry, and trig. Now, I know some of you who don't really like those things. They're not really difficult subjects, and we can teach them pretty easily and pretty fast. And so one of the things that we're pushing is math skills. Math skills so fathers can have decent jobs so they can have a family. The other thing that we are looking at, I call this Welfare 2.0, is that changing our provider system. Most of the people who provide social services are women, and that's the wrong set of providers. So what we would like to have is more men providing services to men, so that men will get what they need to change their trajectory in terms of work. The other thing that we would like to see more of is more perpetrator programs, because a lot of our men have found themselves in a domestic violence situation, and they go into domestic violence programs that are designed by women for what they think men need. And what we'd like to have is more programs that are designed by men for what men need. And so we want to turn our whole system around towards giving men a fair opportunity within our system. And we believe that if we give men a fair opportunity within our system, we start to deal with the goals in TANF, which is to support marriage and father-involved families. That's it.
Thank you very much. Eloise, you spending state money on that?
Some.
Good. Larry, you've thought a lot about this. Okay. We really are jumping around, but we have an organization.
Actually, it sounds quite logical. First of all, great to see so many of those involved in this revolution, and it's really been a great privilege to be involved myself. The states played a crucial role in developing welfare reform. We've heard about that from the governors earlier. Through the waiver experiments and also through the jobs program, states figured out how to build work into the welfare system. They didn't all do it equally well, but we've heard about some exemplars in the case of Wisconsin, Michigan, also New York City, where you had a well-developed and still have a well-developed work system. So this was, I think, a real success. The problem with the Personal Responsibility Act, however, is that it not only allowed the diversion of funds away from TANF proper, but it also did not require that the states maintain the work programs which they had previously instituted. They now could satisfy the work participation requirements mainly by taking credit for the many jobs which welfare mothers got on their own. So what we don't really have in many states today is a serious work program aimed at welfare mothers. What I think Ann is talking about is efforts really to reconstruct the kind of work programs that states had under the waiver system and also under jobs. We need to go back to an idea that there has to be an actual work program aimed at welfare mothers with a structure that allows experimentation, which is still very important, but there has to be a federal structure of goals that means that this program is aimed at the things that we want to lead to, or to come out of welfare. So I think that's the way things are going, and clearly we need to do that. We need to have something beyond the work participation standards and an actual work program. The other thing that I want to do, I would like to see, and I think Eloise has already alluded to this, we need to extend welfare reform beyond welfare mothers, which is essentially what it addressed in the 90s. We need to have, in fact, welfare reform for men. That's what Eloise is really talking about. My previous book was pretty much how one can do that by using the child support system and the criminal justice system. These systems are aimed, in a sense, at punishing men whom we think have obligations to work, but we don't actually create an institution for them to do that. What we need to do, actually, is to have work programs aimed at men who should be working either in child support or in criminal justice. And the states are actually developing these programs more than we realize. It's just that nobody inside the Beltway has heard about it. We need to take seriously the progress that's being made here, and we need especially to move forward with the kind of reforms which the Federal Office of Child Support Enforcement has already suggested. Those reforms have been held up in Congress. We need to unblock that. make it possible for there to be federal funding for state child support work programs, and otherwise develop the institutional structure that will make it possible to have a serious work program for men. So I think that is really the frontier. We need to improve TANF, but especially we need to have welfare reform for men. So I'll lay that huge challenge at your feet and ask people to work on that more than they have up to now.
This conference will continue until midnight. Howard, you were there through the waivers and so forth?
Yeah. Well, one advantage of coming at the end is I don't have to read my notes that I prepared, because most people have said, or a number of people said what I want. I just want to develop a little bit, particularly what Ron and Larry just talked about. It seemed to me in '96 there was great promise that states would develop more comprehensive work programs that would address more issues, would not only deal with getting people into work, but also helping them stay in work, helping them advance. And I think there was initially a lot of enthusiasm for that. I mean, I was at HHS at the time, and a lot of states were interested in that. We ran projects with them, joint efforts together at evaluation. And that pretty much died out. And I think there are a number of reasons why it died out, but I think it's basically what Ron said, is that the money was drained out of the program for other purposes. So work programs have kind of withered rather than developed. And I think the only way we can sort of remedy that is somehow to bring money back for that purpose and for that purpose alone. And maybe Ron is correct that you could do that by restricting TANF. The other option is to put new money in. I think there's a lot of probably disagreement about what the content of that money would go for, but I would say it should go for states to develop work programs. I myself would provide a lot of flexibility and require rigorous evaluation of that. I think that's a way that we could learn about what's effective and what isn't, and I think it could also would energize states again potentially to really take this effort seriously. And I think there are a number of reasons why I think the money left for other reasons. Part of it, I think, that some of them were for good things, like more child care, stronger child protective services. But I think it was also because those things were easy. I mean, you had an existing system, you knew what to do, kind of, and you could augment what was going on. Developing more comprehensive work programs was really a new frontier, and I think that's why it was exciting for a while it lasted and while there's money to support it. So I think it was hard to do. It was easy to take the money, do other things with it, and I think a lot of money just went for purposes totally unrelated to TANF too. And I think it's hard to deny that. So I think the only way to do it is somehow to bring back something like the waiver experience, where the states are encouraged to develop and they're given some money to do it, and that's all they can do with it. And I think that is the only, without money, I don't think there'll be any progress in this area.
Doug, you were at the state level, and now you're spoken widely.
So first, let me admit, if maybe there's something wrong with me, but I'm really enjoying this thing. I guess I'm a policy geek, so I know there's at least 3 or 4 of you out there. But my background, I actually came in as a welfare administrator in the state of Iowa in 1993, right as the state was implementing statewide waivers. And we had a number of waivers. Some were things that we'd copied from other states, like the make work pay concept that you've heard from the governors and from others. One that we did, I was told we were the first at the time to do a true statewide full family sanction. And I came in right as that was implemented, and it kind of varied by week if I was answering more media inquiries on that or signing off on more studies and reports to Howard on impacts and policy changes and process studies. But, I think what we learned out of that, and then subsequently 2 years after POR, I went and worked for Governor Engler for 4 years as his Human Services Director. What we learned out of all of that was that what we were really trying to do in the simplest of forms was increase risks and rewards through things like work incentives, making work pay, opportunities to build assets, supportive services. You're creating the rewards and the opportunities for welfare recipients to go to work. The risks were, of course, really transformed into kind of the form of, we need to make these programs look like employment. These are employment programs, after all. So there has to be consequences. If you don't show up to work on time, you get docked in pay or you lose your job. If you don't participate in the work programs, you lose some or all of your benefits. So I think that was an important message moving forward for us all. When welfare reform passed, I think if I were asked to consolidate into the two things that I think had the biggest impact, one is the flexibility. Everybody's talked about it. There's debates on whether it's good, bad, great, abused, whatever, but I think it really did drive a lot of impacts. And regardless of what you think the bottom line is, I will adamantly defend that the current system is better than what we had under AFDC. The second thing that I think made a huge difference was the work participation rate. It truly changed the culture of state government. We had talked about things like jobs programs under the Family Support Act of '88. We had toyed with the work programs under waivers, but the work participation rate made it real. We had to change the culture. We had to do things differently. So I think as Congress thinks about what they want to do, you know, I started maybe 100,000 foot level, and I'm not so sure I didn't actually accidentally get Ann's notes here, because when I think about the framework, I think you really have to start with a discussion around what are the outcomes you want. You know, under the original TANF, we kind of were about job placements and caseload reduction. We started thinking about things like wage rates and retention, and I would say retention is a great example of a good outcome, because it means you've had a placement, you've got them at an income level that will sustain their work, you've got a participant satisfaction, you've got an employer satisfaction. So I think there has to be agreement on those outcomes. There has to be incentives to drive the behavior. Ann talked about that. And there has to be aspects of program integrity. You know, finally, the work participation rate, it kind of fits into the outcome discussion. I don't think it's working today the way people want it to do. I think states are doing a lot of good things to put people to work. I do think it needs to be restructured. I think we need to talk about outcomes. I hope that flexibility stays. And part of that challenge is the debate around, you know, it started 20 years ago. Is it rapid job attachment or is it work and training? And I've always said the best mix of work and training is a mix of work and training. And it really depends on the participant needs. It depends on your local economic area. What are the jobs? Do you have, you know, an abundance of middle skills jobs that need training, or do you have a lot of entry-level jobs? Do you have sectors with good employers and job demand in which you can create sector-based training programs? And those are the kinds of things that I think drive the need to retain the flexibility so that states can tailor those programs. Doesn't mean there shouldn't be some kind of accountability to drive it, but I think that flexibility will be important. And I'll yield the balance of my time.
Well. Jason, you opened this evening, today. I'm going to have a few words at the end, but you have the last word on the panel.
Thank you, Doug. I'm going to pick up on something that Ann said. One of the tenets is expect work in exchange for benefits. I think it's increasingly difficult, if you adhere to that concept as a way forward from where we are, to effectuate it, and I'll explain why. It's much more difficult today than before. When welfare reform was passed, one of the things we learned is that if caseworkers say, you really have to go to work, and thanks for being in the office, and now we're going to help you look for a job and put you in a position to take a job, when that was perceived as really the only option or the best option, or if you didn't take that option and go to work in the private sector, you would end up working in a community service job or going to training. In other words, your time was occupied. Back then, that was a powerful incentive when we learned that people went right into work, that you don't have to take somebody in the front door and process them through a government program, that really what happens in reality is people act on of their own volition and take jobs that they always could have gotten on their own had they needed to. That part of the system isn't functioning anymore, and the reason for that is the system is awash in money that wasn't there before, that people can survive on, live on, maybe not prosper, but can avoid work. And let me give you 3 examples. Let's take food stamps is the worst. The three examples are the EITC, food stamps, and disability. All of those three programs provide lots of money into the system without obligation to work. And I know you're going to say the EITC does have an obligation to work, and I'm going to try and disabuse you of that. But let's take food stamps first. How many minutes do I have left? 2 minutes. If you look at that chart over there, the green line is TANF, and we went from 96 from 4.7 to 2.1 cases. Now look at food stamps. It exactly tracks it. That's because people on food stamps combined it with TANF, but when they went to work, they usually closed their food stamp cases and they were going to work. Beginning in 2002, an explicit decision by the Food and Nutrition Service in the Bush administration was to expand food stamps, and including non-working food stamp. There was no pairing of work and food stamps. And now look what happened. The red line shows how many those are the same people, the same families, primarily female-headed households that were on TANF, but they're not expected to work and they don't work. Second, disability. The disability roles have expanded immeasurably, and a lot of academic work revolves around the notion that disability, because it's increasingly easy to get, has become a substitute for retirement and for people that want to retire early. And that has to be attacked. The only way to get to that is to condition the accession onto the disability roles with some form of participation standard, including vocational education. It's not there, and this Congress won't abide by it, neither will the Social Security Administration in the form of a waiver. Now, finally, the EITC, and this is the most disturbing of all, because initially the EITC pairs your obligation or your actual work with benefits, and that's a good thing. But here's what we learned in Wisconsin at the welfare office. Between January and March of each year, welfare recipients won't come in, as many of them, most of them, to participate in their work activity because they take the EITC benefit without having earned it. What that means is you can go online, and we showed the Ways and Means Committee how to do this. You can go online with TurboTax, make up self-employment, take children from other families with their Social Security numbers, submit it, and 45 days later you'll get a check for $6,000. That's a huge problem right now. So if you take those three things, you really have a system now that we didn't have 20 years ago. You have a system that exists without work or without the obligation to work. So the next thing we need to do is to focus on fraud, but also focus on all programs should have a work requirement or an activity requirement enforced of one kind or another.
Jason, thank you. So looking at you. Look, I'm an academic these days, and so I'm forced to come to a couple of conclusions. I'm an academic, and I'm forced to come to some conclusions, besides the conclusion of this wonderful program. This thing we call welfare reform took 20 or 30 years. Larry, when did you write about New York City's WIN program? Just what year?
First article was 83, I think.
And about a program that started in the late 70s.
1967.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was a history with a lot of people getting involved. And we heard in the last panel, well, nothing much is going on and so forth. But yet we heard a little bit in this panel about some of the things that are going on. And part of that is we haven't had a process that brings that to the attention of policymakers or the public in the way that 20 or 30-year period of welfare reform took place. Secondly, you heard a number of people talking about job training, and I'm here to tell you, I inhaled too, to coin a phrase. But the fact is, we don't really know how to do it. The fact is, we don't have an infrastructure for doing it. And that's a long, hard slog. The sooner we start, the better, but let us realize that we're not doing all that much today. And then the last point I would make, A number of people talked about the waivers, the experiments, and the money that was available either within the AFDC system or from the states and the experiments themselves. And we're clearly going to need, I don't think this is a political comment, we're clearly going to need some money to lubricate this system. Whether the money comes from new appropriations or whether it comes from a super waiver, that's something that we hope will be on the table and people will work it out. But you can't think that this process can move to fruition by having 10 or 15 experts sit around a table and come to a conclusion. It'll take the kind of work that started in the 60s, really, and the 70s, and came to fruition in the 90s, and it's just that process has to start again. For the organizers, let me thank you very much. You've been a great audience, and before you clap and all that sort of stuff for this great panel, Jason wants to make an announcement.
Thank you, Doug. There's several of us that are getting together for dinner at Bullfeathers, Dutch treat, after the reception, which would be approximately 6:45 or something like that. So if you would like to come and pay your own dinner and sit in tables.
You heard that. Dutch treat. You heard that, right?
That's right. That's okay, too. Stand up, please. If you would stand up, Tammy. There she is. If you would let Tammy know you'd like to join us about 6:45 p.m., we'll be leaving from here and walking to Bullfeathers. We'd love to have you.
And wait a minute. Now, when do they fill those tables over there with whatever?
Right away.
Right away? So we just stand here for a minute or so?
No.
You have to say
This is 5:45. At 6:45, we're going to.
No, those tables right
No,
there.
they need a queue.
When does the reception start?
Immediately.
Right? All right.
Immediately, yeah.
There you go. All right. Thank you.